Night has fallen, and the gas lamps are beginning to flicker. I am NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, I will take you beyond an ordinary sleep, deep into the secret-filled heart of the 19th century. Are you ready to meet Detective Arthur Pendergast? Our journey spans 50 chapters, from the velvet wings of the theatre to the dark, silent waters of the Thames. This mystery will be whispered to you as you drift into a deep slumber. Lean back, and prepare to lose yourself in the fog. Arthur Pendergast adjusted his heavy wool coat as he walked. The London fog was thick and yellow. It felt like a wet blanket over the city. It was a cold November night in the year 1890. Arthur was a private investigator. He was a man of 40 years with sharp eyes and a quiet voice. Usually, he spent his nights in dark offices or near the docks. But tonight, he was at the Royal Theatre. The theatre was a grand building. Large stone pillars stood at the entrance. Bright gas lamps burned on the walls. They cast a warm, orange glow on the wet street. Many carriages arrived at the front door. The horses' hooves made a steady rhythm on the stone road. Men in black suits and women in long, silk dresses stepped out of the carriages. They talked as they entered the warm building. Arthur walked inside. The lobby was full of the smell of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. He saw Mr. Grimaldi, the theatre manager. Mr. Grimaldi was a tall, thin man. He wore a very clean tuxedo and a tall top hat. He smiled at the guests, but his eyes moved quickly. He looked nervous. Arthur watched him for a moment. A detective always notices when a person is worried. "Good evening, Mr. Pendergast," Grimaldi said. He recognized Arthur from a previous case. "I am glad you are here. We have a full house tonight. It is a beautiful evening for a play." Arthur replied. He handed his ticket to a young man at the door. Arthur walked to his seat. The inside of the theatre was magnificent. The seats were covered in soft red velvet. A giant glass lamp hung from the ceiling. It had hundreds of small candles. High above the stage, there were gold decorations of angels and flowers. It was a place of wealth and beauty. The room became dark. The heavy red curtains moved slowly to the sides. The play was a famous story about a lost queen. The music of the violins rose from the front of the stage. The melody was beautiful and sad. Then, the lead actress appeared. Elara was the most famous actress in London. She walked onto the stage with grace. She wore a long, blue dress. It was covered in small silver stones that caught the light. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. Every person in the theatre was silent. They did not want to miss a single word. She was the star of the show. Arthur sat back in his chair. He watched Elara carefully. She was a great artist. However, even in the middle of the play, Arthur felt something strange. He looked at the shadows behind the stage. He saw a man standing in the dark corner of the wings. The man did not look like an actor. He stayed very still and watched Elara with great intensity. Arthur frowned. He came to the theatre to rest. However, his mind was already working. A detective never truly stops looking for secrets. The play continued, but Arthur's eyes stayed on the shadows near the stage. The second act of the play began after a short break. The audience sat down again. The violins played a faster, more tense melody. The air in the theatre felt heavy with expectation. Everyone wanted to see what happened next to the queen in the story. Elara returned to the stage. The silver stones on her blue dress sparkled even more than before. She stood in a circle of white light. Her character was alone in a dark forest. She looked around with fear in her eyes. Her performance was very realistic. Arthur watched her closely. He also looked toward the wings. The dark figure he saw earlier was still there. The man was a shadow against the wooden walls. "I am lost," Elara said. Her voice was a soft whisper that traveled to the back of the room. "The stars are gone, and the path is hidden." Arthur felt a chill. The man in the shadows moved. He was now very close to the mechanism that controlled the lights. Arthur stood up from his chair. He wanted to say something, but he did not want to ruin the performance. He began to walk quietly toward the side of the stage. Suddenly, the gas lamps began to flicker. The light turned from orange to a weak yellow. Then, every lamp in the theater went out. The darkness was total. It was impossible to see a hand in front of a face. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, the people in the audience began to speak at once. Their voices were low and filled with confusion. Someone in the back of the room called for the manager. Arthur did not move. He listened. He heard the rustle of heavy cloth. He heard the soft sound of boots on the wooden stage. He also smelled something strange. It was a sharp, chemical scent. It was not the usual smell of the theater. "Bring the lights," a man shouted from the balcony. After a minute of chaos, the stagehands returned with small torches. They began to light the gas lamps again one by one. The warm glow slowly returned to the Royal Theatre. The audience looked at the stage, expecting to see Elara. The stage was empty. The circle of light was still there, but the Queen was gone. There was no sign of the blue dress or the silver stones. Only a single white flower lay on the floor where she had stood just a moment before. Mr. Grimaldi ran onto the stage from the side. His face was very pale. He looked at the empty space and then at the audience. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The people in the seats stood up. The quiet room was now full of loud voices and questions. Arthur pushed through the crowd. He did not look at the frightened people. He looked at the stage. He knew this was not part of the play. This was a crime. Backstage was full of confusion. Actors in colorful costumes ran in every direction. Stagehands shouted to each other about the gas lamps. Nobody knew where Elara was. Arthur did not listen to the noise. He walked quickly down a narrow hallway behind the stage. He looked at the wooden doors. Finally, he found a door with a gold star on it. It had the name Miss Elara written in large black letters. Arthur turned the handle. The door was not locked. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was very quiet. It was a big change from the noisy theater outside. The dressing room was large and beautiful. There were many vases of white roses on the tables. The smell of the flowers was very strong and sweet. In the center of the room, there was a large mirror. Many small lights burned around the glass. On the table in front of the mirror, Arthur saw many bottles of face paint and powder. A pair of white silk gloves lay next to a hairbrush. Everything looked normal. It looked like the actress was ready to return at any moment. Arthur walked further into the room. He saw a long, black wool coat hanging on a chair. Next to the coat was a small leather bag. Arthur opened the bag carefully. Inside, he found a small purse with gold coins, a white handkerchief, and a silver mirror. He closed the bag. Elara did not take her money or her coat. She did not plan to leave the theater tonight. If a person leaves a building in the cold London winter, they always take their coat. Arthur touched the back of the chair. The velvet was still warm. Elara was here only a short time ago. He looked at the floor near the door. He saw a small piece of blue silk. It was a bright blue color. He knew it was a piece from her stage dress. He picked it up and held it in his hand. The edge of the silk was torn. Suddenly, the door opened. A woman entered the room. She was wearing a plain grey dress and a white apron. She looked very frightened. Her hands were shaking. She was Elara's assistant. "Where is she?" the woman asked. Her voice was thin and high. "Where is Miss Elara?" The manager is looking for her. I'm trying to find her, Arthur said in a calm voice. I am a detective. When did you last see her? She was on the stage for the second act. The woman replied. I came here to prepare her next dress for the final scene. But the room was empty. She never came back after the lights went out. Arthur looked at the window. It was very high up and very small. A person could not fit through it. The only way out of the room was the door. But the hallway was full of people. How did a famous actress disappear without anyone seeing her? Arthur looked at the floor again. He noticed a strange mark in the dust near the heavy wooden wardrobe. Arthur left the dressing room. The hallway was still full of noise. Actors were crying and the stagehands were moving furniture. He walked past them and followed a long, cold corridor. This path led to the stage door. This was the only way for people to enter or leave the back of the theater. At the end of the corridor, there was a large wooden door. It was very thick and had heavy iron edges. A man sat on a small wooden chair next to the door. He was an older man with a grey beard and a blue uniform. His name was Samuel, and he was the theater's guard. Good evening, Arthur said. He showed a small card that proved he was a detective. I am Arthur Pendergast. I need to ask you some questions. Samuel looked up. His eyes were wide with worry. I know why you are here, sir. Everyone is talking about Miss Elara. It is a terrible thing. Did anyone leave through this door in the last 20 minutes? Arthur asked. He looked at the heavy iron bolt on the door. Samuel shook his head quickly. No one, sir. I have been sitting here since the play started. I did not move. When the lights went out, I stayed right here in the dark. Are you sure? Arthur stepped closer to the door. It was very dark. Perhaps someone slipped past you in the shadows. The door was locked from the inside, sir. Samuel explained. He pointed to the iron bolt. Look at the dust on the handle. If someone moved that bolt, the dust would be gone. But the dust is still there. I also have the only key to the lock. Arthur examined the door. The guard was right. A thick layer of grey dust covered the metal bolt. There were no finger marks on it. He also looked at the floor. There were no footprints near the door except for the guard's own boots. Is there another way out? Arthur asked. Only the front doors where the audience enters. Samuel replied. But the ushers are there. They would see a famous actress walk out in a blue stage dress. And the small windows in the rooms are too high and too narrow for a person. Arthur felt the cold air coming from under the door. He knew the guard was telling the truth. The building was like a giant box, and the box was closed. If Elara did not walk out the front door, and she did not walk out the back door, then she was still inside the Royal Theatre. A loud voice echoed from the stage area. It was Mr. Grimaldi. He was calling for the police. Arthur turned away from the door. He needed to look at the stage again. He remembered the man he saw in the shadows before the lights went out. Stay at your post, Samuel, Arthur said. Do not let anyone in or out. I won't move, sir. The guard promised. Arthur walked back toward the stage. He did not look at the actors. He looked at the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. He was looking for a secret. Arthur walked back to the main stage area. The panic among the actors was slowly turning into a quiet, nervous energy. Most of the people were gathered in small groups, talking in whispers. However, one woman stood alone near a tall wooden pillar. She was Beatrice, the second most famous actress in the theatre. Beatrice was a beautiful woman with dark hair and very green eyes. She was wearing a long dress made of dark green silk. She did not look frightened or worried. Instead, she was looking at the empty stage with a calm expression. She was even holding a small glass of water with a steady hand. "Good evening, Miss Beatrice," Arthur said as he approached her. Beatrice turned her head slowly. She looked at Arthur and gave him a small, cold smile. "The detective," she said. Her voice was smooth and deep. "Are you here to find our lost queen? It is a very dramatic night, is it not? It is a serious night," Arthur replied. He watched her eyes carefully. "You seem very calm, Miss Beatrice. Most of the other actors are quite upset." Beatrice laughed softly. "I am an actress, Mr. Pendergast. I know that things often happen in the theatre. People forget their lines, the lights fail, or someone gets sick. The show must always continue." "Elara did not just get sick," Arthur said. "She vanished in total darkness. Did you see anything strange before the lights went out?" Beatrice put her glass of water down on a nearby table. She looked at her fingernails. "I was in the wings on the other side of the stage. I was waiting for my next scene. I saw Elara standing in her light. She looked very pretty, as always. Then, the lights died. I heard nothing but the sound of the wind outside." Arthur remembered the man he saw in the shadows. "Did you see anyone else near the stage? A man, perhaps? Someone who does not work here?" Beatrice paused for a second. Her eyes moved to the left, then back to Arthur. "No. I saw no one. It was a very busy stage. There are always people moving in the dark. I heard that you wanted Elara's role in this play," Arthur said directly. Beatrice's smile disappeared. Her face became hard like stone. "Every actress wants the lead role, Mr. Pendergast. Elara is, or was, a talented woman. But she was also very tired. Perhaps she simply walked out because she could not take the pressure anymore. She left her coat and her money." Arthur noted. "A woman does not walk out into a cold London night without her coat." "Then maybe she is hiding," Beatrice said with a shrug. "She always loved attention. Now, she has the attention of the whole city." As Beatrice turned to walk away, Arthur noticed something. On the sleeve of her green dress, there was a tiny white thread. It looked like a piece of white lace. He remembered that the flower left on the stage was also white. Beatrice walked away with her head held high, but Arthur felt she was not telling him everything. She was not sad that Elara was gone. In fact, she looked like a woman who was ready to take the lead role tomorrow. Arthur watched Beatrice walk away. She moved with a confidence that felt wrong for the situation. He did not follow her. Instead, he turned his attention to the people who worked behind the scenes. These were the men who moved the heavy scenery and pulled the thick ropes. They saw everything, but people rarely looked at them. He found a young man named Ben sitting on a wooden crate. Ben was a stagehand. He was about 25 years old. His face was covered in dust from the stage, and his hands were rough from hard work. He was staring at the floor, his face pale with worry. "Ben, I need to talk to you," Arthur said gently. The young man looked up. "Are you the detective? Is Miss Elara okay? Did they find her?" "Not yet," Arthur replied. He sat on a nearby crate to be at the same level as Ben. "I need your help. You were working near the stage before the lights went out. Did you see anything unusual? Anything at all?" Ben looked around to make sure no one was listening. He leaned closer to Arthur. His voice was a low whisper. "I saw someone, sir. Someone who does not work here. I told the head stagehand, but he told me to go back to work." Arthur's eyes sharpened. "Tell me what you saw." "It was about 10 minutes before the second act," Ben said. "I was moving a large painted tree behind the curtain. I looked toward the back corner where the ropes are kept. It is a very dark place. I saw a man standing there. He was very tall and wore a long, dark coat. Did you see his face? Arthur asked. Ben shook his head. That is the strange part, sir. He was wearing a mask. It was a silver mask. It caught the light for just a second. It looked cold and hard. He did not move. He just stood there, watching the stage. Arthur remembered the shadow he had seen from the audience. What did he do next? He stayed there until the music started. Ben explained. When the music became loud, he moved behind a large wooden wall. Then the lights went out. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. And Miss Elara was gone, too. Thank you, Ben. You did the right thing by telling me, Arthur said. He stood up and walked toward the back corner that Ben had described. It was a cold, lonely part of the theater. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and grease. Arthur held a small lantern in his hand. The light moved across the floor. He looked for any sign of the man in the silver mask. Near the ropes, he found a small, dark object. He picked it up. It was a heavy metal bolt. But it was broken. This was the bolt that controlled the main gas line for the stage lamps. Someone had broken it on purpose. It was not an accident. The darkness was a planned part of the crime. Arthur looked up at the high wooden walls. The theater was a maze of secrets. A man in a silver mask was hiding in the shadows, and now the detective knew exactly where to start his search. Arthur walked onto the center of the stage. The theater was now much quieter. Most of the audience had gone home. Only a few police officers stood at the doors. The white flower still lay on the dark wood. Arthur knelt down and looked at the floorboards. He held his lantern close to the ground. The light showed the fine lines of the wood and the dust of many years. He remembered where Elara was standing. She was exactly in the middle of the white light. Arthur moved the flower and touched the wood with his fingers. He felt a small gap between two boards. It was very thin, but it was there. He pushed against the wood, but it did not move. It was solid. There must be a way. Arthur whispered to himself. He looked at the scenery around him. There were painted trees and large wooden boxes. He walked behind a tall piece of scenery that looked like a stone wall. He found a small iron lever hidden behind a heavy red curtain. The lever was cold and greasy. Arthur gripped the handle and pulled it with all his strength. A heavy grinding noise came from the floor. A small square of the stage began to sink down. It was a trapdoor. It was perfectly hidden. When it was closed, it looked exactly like the rest of the floor. Arthur watched as the wooden square lowered into the dark space beneath the stage. This is how she vanished, Arthur said. He took his lantern and looked down into the hole. There was a wooden ladder that led into a dark basement. The air coming from the hole was cold and smelled of damp earth and old metal. It was a very deep drop. Arthur did not hesitate. He put one foot on the ladder and began to climb down. The wood of the ladder felt old and dry under his hands. Every step he took made the ladder move slightly. Finally, his boots touched a hard stone floor. He was now under the stage. This area was a maze of wooden pillars and thick ropes. The ceiling was very low. Arthur had to bend his head as he walked. He moved his lantern around the room. He saw old costumes hanging on hooks. They looked like ghosts in the dim light. He saw broken chairs and boxes of old stage props. He walked toward the area directly under the trapdoor. On the floor, he saw a small piece of silver jewelry. He picked it up. It was a small earring with a blue stone. It was part of the jewelry Elara wore during the play. Next to the earring, there were fresh footprints in the dust. They were the footprints of two people. One set of prints was small and light. The other set was very large and deep. Arthur followed the footprints. They led away from the stage and toward a small wooden door in the basement wall. The door was half open. Arthur felt a cold wind on his face. He knew the mystery was much bigger than the theatre. Someone had taken Elara into the dark tunnels of London. Arthur followed the footprints across the stone floor of the basement. The light from his lantern danced on the damp walls. He stopped near a large wooden trunk. The trunk was old and the iron corners were orange with rust. It was sitting near a pile of heavy ropes. The lid of the trunk was open. Inside, Arthur saw a flash of bright color. He reached into the trunk and pulled out a dress. It was a beautiful gown made of light blue silk. It was exactly like the dress Elara wore on the stage. This was her spare costume. Actresses often have a second dress in case the first one is damaged. The fabric felt soft and expensive. Arthur looked at the dress carefully. He was not looking for beauty. He was looking for a clue. He felt the heavy fabric of the skirt. There was a small pocket hidden in the folds of the silk. He put his hand inside the pocket and felt a piece of paper. It was a small, folded note. Arthur opened the paper and held his lantern close. The writing was messy and the ink was dark. The message was short and frightening. Elara, the note began. This is your last warning. You must leave London by Friday. Do not perform tonight. If you stay, the theatre will be your grave. Go now and do not look back. Arthur felt a chill that was not from the cold basement air. The note was not signed. There was no name at the bottom of the page. He looked at the paper again. The edges were a bit yellow, and it smelled of a strong, cheap tobacco. It was a smell he knew from the busy taverns near the river. She knew, Arthur whispered to himself. She knew someone was coming for her. He wondered why Elara did not go to the police. Why did she stay and perform? Perhaps she thought she was safe inside the theatre with so many people watching. Or perhaps she was being watched every moment. Arthur looked at the spare dress again. Why was it here in the basement? Usually, spare costumes are kept in the dressing room or a storage area on the main floor. Someone must have brought it down here. Maybe the person in the silver mask put it here to hide the letter. Or maybe Elara hid it herself. The footprints continued past the trunk. They led toward the small wooden door in the wall that Arthur saw earlier. The large footprints were very clear here. They were deep in the dust. The person carrying Elara was very strong. Arthur put the letter in his own pocket. He held his cane tightly in his right hand. He was a man of peace. But he knew the streets of London could be dangerous. He pushed the small wooden door open. It did not make a sound, but a cloud of dust rose into the air. Behind the door was a narrow, dark passage. It did not look like part of the theatre. It looked like an old tunnel. The passage was narrow and the walls were made of cold, grey stone. It felt like walking through a grave. Arthur moved slowly. He held his lantern high to see the path. The tunnel did not go deep into the earth. Instead, it led to a set of small wooden stairs. Arthur climbed the stairs and found a small door. He pushed it open and stepped into a room. The room was full of books and papers. It was a private office. Arthur looked around and realized where he was. He was in the lower office of Mr. Grimaldi. This was a secret room under the main office. A large desk sat in the corner. A single candle burned on the desk. Mr. Grimaldi was there. He was sitting in a chair, holding his head in his hands. He looked old and tired. When he saw Arthur, he jumped up. His face turned very red. "What are you doing here?" Grimaldi shouted. "You have no right to be in this room." "I am looking for Miss Elara," Arthur said. He walked toward the desk. "I found the trapdoor on the stage. It leads here." Grimaldi sat down again. He looked at the floor. "I did not want this to happen," he whispered. "I love this theatre. It is my life. Arthur saw a large black book on the desk. It was open. He walked over and looked at the pages. It was a record of money. There were many numbers written in red ink. In the world of business, red ink means debt. Mr. Grimaldi owed a lot of money to many different people. "You are in trouble, Mr. Grimaldi," Arthur said. "You owe thousands of pounds. To whom do you owe this money?" Grimaldi did not answer at first. He looked at the candle. "London is a dangerous place for a man with no money. I borrowed from a group of men. They call themselves the Silver Circle. They are not kind men." "Did they take Elara?" Arthur asked. "They wanted something valuable," Grimaldi said. His voice was shaking. "They told me my debt would go away if Elara disappeared. They said she would be safe, but she had to leave the stage. They wanted the theatre to fail so they could buy the land." Arthur felt a wave of anger. "So you helped them? You let a man in a silver mask take her?" "I had no choice," Grimaldi cried. "They threatened my life. But I did not know they would take her during the play. I thought they would talk to her in private." "Where did they take her?" Arthur demanded. He grabbed the edge of the desk. "I don't know," Grimaldi said. "I truly don't. They only told me to break the gas line and open the trapdoor. A carriage was waiting at the end of the tunnel." Arthur looked at the manager with disgust. Grimaldi was a weak man. He sold his star actress to save his own skin. Arthur turned toward the door. He had to follow the tunnel to the street. He had to find that carriage. Arthur left Mr. Grimaldi in the dark office. He did not feel sorry for the manager. A man who sells a friend to pay a debt is not a good man. Arthur walked back through the narrow passage and returned to the stage. The police were now moving around the theatre. They were looking at the trapdoor with lanterns. Arthur went back to Elara's dressing room. He wanted to check one more thing. The room was still full of the sweet smell of white roses. Martha, the assistant, was sitting on a chair. She was drying her eyes with a handkerchief. She looked up when Arthur entered. "Detective, did you find anything?" she asked. "I found a few clues, Martha," Arthur said. He walked over to the dressing table. "Tell me about Miss Elara's jewelry. Was she wearing everything tonight?" Martha stood up and walked to the table. She pointed to a small, blue velvet box. She was wearing the silver earrings and the rings for the first act, but she was supposed to put on the sea star necklace for the second act. Arthur opened the blue velvet box. It was empty. The inside of the box was soft and clean, but the jewelry was gone. "What is the sea star?" "It is a famous necklace," Martha explained. Her voice was full of pride for her mistress. "It has 10 large diamonds and a very big blue sapphire in the center. It is worth thousands of pounds. Lord Harrington gave it to her as a gift last year." Arthur looked at the empty box. He remembered the small earring he found in the basement. It had a blue stone. That was part of the set. But the necklace was the real prize. Did she put the necklace on before she went to the stage? Arthur asked. "Yes, sir," Martha replied. "I saw her put it around her neck. She looked like a queen. The blue stone matched her dress perfectly. If she is gone, the necklace is gone too." Arthur rubbed his chin. He thought about the man in the silver mask and the silver circle. Were they kidnappers, or were they thieves? Perhaps they wanted both the woman and the diamonds. The diamond necklace was famous in London. It would be very difficult to sell such a famous item. This was a very big crime, Arthur said. They planned the lights, the trapdoor, and the theft. They knew exactly when she would be wearing the diamonds. He looked around the room once more. He noticed a small, dark spot on the floor near the mirror. It was not dust. It was a drop of red liquid. He touched it with his finger. It was still wet. He looked at the white roses in the vase. One of the flowers was broken. Arthur felt a sense of urgency. The mystery was growing. There was a kidnapping, a theft, and now a sign of a struggle. He needed to find the carriage that left the theatre. He needed to find Elara before the Silver Circle took her away from London. "Stay here, Martha," Arthur said. "If anyone comes for Elara's things, call the police officer at the door." Arthur walked out of the room. He felt the cold wind from the stage door. He was ready to leave the theatre and go into the dark streets. Arthur walked back onto the main stage. The police officers were talking near the front of the building. Their voices were low, and their boots made steady sounds on the wooden floor. The theatre felt different now. It was no longer a place of art and music. It felt like a crime scene. Arthur stood in the middle of the stage and looked at the heavy red curtains. The curtains were made of thick, expensive velvet. They were very tall and very heavy. They hung from the ceiling like giant red walls. Arthur remembered seeing the shadow of the man in the silver mask near the right side of the curtain. He walked toward that spot. He held his lantern high. The light moved over the red fabric. At first, everything looked normal. Then, he saw something dark near the edge of the curtain. It was about 4 feet from the floor. He stepped closer. The dark spot was a stain. In the orange light of the lantern, the stain looked almost black. Arthur touched the fabric with his finger. The velvet felt cold and wet. He brought his finger to the light. The liquid was red. It was fresh blood. "There was a struggle," Arthur whispered. He looked at the floor below the stain. He did not see any more blood on the wood. This meant the injury was probably not deep. But someone was hurt. Was it Elara? Or did she fight back and hurt the man in the mask? Arthur hoped she was strong enough to fight. He examined the curtain more carefully. He saw that the fabric was pulled tight. One of the heavy gold ropes that held the curtain was slightly torn. It looked like someone grabbed the rope and pulled it with great force. Detective Pendergast. Arthur turned around. It was Inspector Reed. The inspector was a short man with a thick mustache and a very serious face. He walked onto the stage and looked at Arthur's lantern. "I found blood, Inspector," Arthur said. He pointed to the stain on the red velvet. Inspector Reed looked at the spot and frowned. "This is not good. We thought she just went through the trapdoor. But if there is blood, there was violence. My men found a witness outside. A carriage drove away very fast right after the lights went out." "I know about the carriage," Arthur said. "Mr. Grimaldi told me. It was waiting at the end of the secret passage. But this blood tells a new story. Elara did not go quietly. She is a brave woman." "We must find that carriage," Reed said. "London is a big city, but a fast carriage at night is easy to notice." Arthur looked at the blood on his finger. He felt a heavy weight in his heart. The mystery of the vanishing actress was now a race against time. The Silver Circle had the actress and the diamonds, but they also had a woman who was willing to fight. "I am going to the docks," Arthur told the inspector. The manager mentioned a group of men. "They are dangerous. I need to find where they go." "Be careful, Arthur," Reed warned. "These men do not like detectives." Arthur nodded. He walked off the stage for the last time that night. He left the blood on the curtain and the empty theatre behind him. He stepped out into the foggy night. The cold air hit his face, and he began his search for the silver mask. Arthur stood outside the theatre. The night air was freezing. The yellow fog moved around the gas lamps like a ghost. Most of the carriages were gone now. The street was quiet. But Arthur did not leave. He hid in the deep shadows of a stone wall. He waited and watched the side door of the building. A few minutes later, the door opened slowly. Mr. Grimaldi stepped out. He did not have his top hat or his fine coat. He looked like a different man. He pulled his collar up to hide his face. He looked to the left and then to the right. He was very nervous. He began to walk quickly away from the bright lights of the main street. Arthur followed him. He stayed far behind. He walked softly on the wet stones. He did not want the manager to hear his boots. They walked past dark shops and closed houses. The only sound was the distant ring of a bell from a boat on the river. The smell of the water was strong here. It was a mix of salt, old wood, and smoke. Grimaldi turned into a narrow alley. The walls of the buildings were very close together. There was no light from the gas lamps here. It was almost total darkness. Arthur stopped at the corner. He leaned against the cold brick wall and looked into the alley. At the end of the path, near a pile of old wooden boxes, a man was waiting. This man was very tall. He wore a long black coat that touched his boots. He did not move. He stood like a statue in the shadows. He did not wear a silver mask, but his face was hidden by a large hat. "You are late," the tall man said. His voice was cold and hard. "I am sorry," Grimaldi replied. His voice was shaking. "The detective is everywhere. He found the trapdoor. He even found the blood on the curtain. I had to wait for him to leave." "The detective is not your problem," the man in the black coat said. "Your problem is the money. You still owe the silver circle. The girl was only the beginning of your payment." "But you have her," Grimaldi cried. "And you have the diamonds. Surely that is enough." The tall man stepped forward. He was much bigger than the manager. "The diamonds are for the boss. The girl is for the lord. You still have a debt to the circle. We want the keys to the theater safe." "I cannot do that," Grimaldi whispered. "The police are there." "Then find a way," the man said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy object. He handed it to Grimaldi. "Take this. If the detective asks more questions, use it. Do not let him stop our plan." Arthur tried to see what the object was, but it was too dark. He moved a small stone with his foot by accident. The sound was very quiet, but the man in the black coat heard it. He turned his head quickly toward the entrance of the alley. "Who is there?" the man shouted. Arthur pressed his back against the wall. He held his breath. He did not move a single muscle. The silence in the alley was heavy and frightening. The tall man did not move at first. He looked into the darkness of the alley. Arthur could not see the man's eyes, but he felt the man's gaze. The silence was very heavy. A cold wind blew through the narrow space. It moved the old boxes and pieces of paper on the ground. The tall man reached into his long coat. He pulled out a piece of metal. It was not a gun. It was a mask. It was the silver mask. The man placed the mask over his face. In the dim light of the distant street lamp, the silver surface looked cold and hard. It had no expression. It had two dark holes for eyes and a thin line for a mouth. When the man put it on, he no longer looked like a person. He looked like a monster made of metal. "I know you are there, detective," the man said. His voice was different now. It sounded strange and empty behind the silver mask. "You are very brave, but you are also very foolish. You should not follow the shadows." Arthur did not move. He kept his back against the bricks. He held his wooden cane tightly. He was ready to fight if he had to. He knew that the man could see him if he stepped just 1 inch to the left. "Give me the detective," Grimaldi cried. The manager was shaking with fear. "He knows too much. He will go to the police." The masked man turned his head toward Grimaldi. "The police cannot help him. The silver circle is everywhere. If Mr. Pendergast wants to live, he will go home. He will forget about the theater. He will forget about the girl." The man in the mask stepped toward the spot where Arthur was hiding. His boots made a heavy, slow sound on the wet stones. He stopped only a few feet away. Arthur could smell the sharp tobacco again. It was the same smell from the letter he found in the blue dress. "Listen to me, Arthur Pendergast," the man whispered. "Elara is gone. She belongs to the Lord now. If you try to find her, you will find only your own death. This is the only warning you will get." The masked man turned around. He did not look back. He walked to the end of the alley where a dark carriage was waiting. The carriage was completely black. Even the horses were black. Grimaldi followed him, running like a frightened dog. They climbed into the carriage, and the driver pulled the ropes. The carriage moved away quickly. The sound of the wheels on the stone road slowly faded away. Arthur finally stepped out of the shadows. His heart was beating fast. He was safe for now, but the threat was clear. The Silver Circle was not just a group of thieves. They were organized and they were dangerous. They knew his name. He looked down at the ground where the carriage had been. He saw a small, white piece of paper. It was wet from the rain and the fog. He picked it up carefully. Arthur smoothed the wet paper with his fingers. The ink was a bit blurry, but he could still read the words. It was a delivery note for a large building. The address was written clearly at the bottom: Warehouse 12, River Lane. Arthur knew this area. It was a part of London near the docks where the big ships arrived. It was a place of heavy fog, dark water, and many secrets. He walked quickly to the main road and found a small horse-drawn cab. "Take me to River Lane, near the docks," Arthur told the driver. The driver looked at Arthur's fine coat and then at the dark, foggy night. He seemed surprised, but he nodded. The ride was slow. The horse walked carefully on the wet stones. The fog was even thicker near the River Thames. It smelled of salt, old wood, and wet mud. Finally, the driver stopped the carriage. "I cannot go further, sir," the man said. "The road is too narrow and the fog is too deep." Arthur paid the driver and stepped out. He was now in a very lonely part of the city. The gas lamps were far apart. The only sound was the water of the river hitting the wooden docks. It was a steady, splashing sound. Arthur walked down the narrow street. He passed many tall buildings made of dark red bricks. They had no lights in the windows. He found Warehouse 12. It was a massive building. The doors were made of thick wood with heavy iron bars. Above the door, there was an old, faded sign. It said Riverside Trading. Arthur looked at the letters. He wondered if this was the RT he would later learn about. Near the side of the building, he saw something that made his heart beat faster. The black carriage from the alley was there. The horses were gone, but the carriage was parked in the shadows of the warehouse wall. This was the place. Elara was inside. Arthur did not go to the front door. He knew it would be locked. He walked around to the back of the building. Near the water, he found a small metal door. He turned the handle, but it did not move. He looked up and saw a small window. It was high, but it was half open. Arthur moved a large wooden crate under the window. He stood on the crate and pulled himself up. He was a strong man, and he moved with care. He did not want to make a single sound. He climbed through the window and dropped onto the floor inside. The warehouse was very large and very dark. The air was cold and smelled of dust. There were hundreds of wooden boxes stacked high toward the ceiling. They looked like giant towers in the shadows. In the distance, Arthur saw a small glow of light. He also heard the sound of men talking. Their voices were low and echoed in the big room. "We must move her before the sun rises," a man said. Arthur hid behind a large box. He stayed very still. He was now inside the enemy's home. Arthur stayed very still behind a large wooden crate. His heart beat fast. but he kept his breathing quiet and steady. The warehouse was like a giant cave of wood and shadows. High above, the moon shone through the small window. It made thin lines of white light on the dusty floor. The air was very cold, and Arthur could see his own breath in the dim light. He looked toward the center of the room. Two men stood near a small wooden table. One man was the tall person he saw before. The man was not wearing the silver mask now, but his face was still in the shadows. The other man was shorter and wore a dirty brown coat. They had a single lantern on the table. The light from the lantern was weak and orange. It made their shadows look like giants on the walls. "The boat will be here in 1 hour," the taller man said. His voice was low and serious. "We must prepare the lady. The Lord does not like to wait. He wants to leave London before the sun rises." The shorter man nodded. "The carriage is ready. We just need to move the boxes in front of the cellar door." The two men picked up the lantern and walked away into a dark corner of the warehouse. Arthur waited for a moment. When he could no longer hear the sound of their boots on the floor, he moved. He walked softly, stepping carefully to avoid any dry pieces of wood. He reached the small table where the men were standing just a minute ago. The table was covered in dust. There was an old glass of water and a few pieces of paper. Arthur did not look at the papers yet. His eyes saw something small and dark on the corner of the table. It was a key. Arthur picked it up. The key was made of heavy, dark iron. It felt cold and rough in his hand. It was an old style of key, the kind used for very thick doors or heavy iron chests. He held it up to the thin line of moonlight. On the top of the key, there were 2 letters carved into the metal, RT. RT, Arthur whispered to himself. Riverside Trading. He remembered the faded sign outside the warehouse. This key belonged to this building. But it was not a common key. It was special. Perhaps it opened the hidden room where they were keeping Elara. He felt a small spark of hope. He put the key safely into his coat pocket. Just then, he heard a new sound from the back of the building. It was the sound of a heavy wooden door moving on its hinges. He also heard the low, rhythmic sound of a horse outside on the stones. More men were arriving. Arthur looked around for a safe place. He saw a row of tall wooden cabinets against the far wall. He moved quickly and stepped into the space behind them. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall and waited. He watched as 3 more men entered the room. They were carrying large lanterns and heavy coils of rope. The mystery of the warehouse was becoming more dangerous with every passing minute. Arthur stayed in the dark space behind the tall wooden cabinets. He did not move. He watched the men in the warehouse through a small gap between the boards. The new men walked past him, carrying heavy coils of rope. They were moving toward the back of the building. One of the men stopped near the small table. He was the man in the dirty brown coat. "How is the lady?" the man asked. His voice was loud in the empty room. "She is quiet now," the tall man replied. "She was very angry earlier. She cut her hand when she grabbed the gold rope at the theater. There was a lot of blood. We had to find a doctor who does not ask too many questions." "Did he fix her hand?" "Yes. Dr. Holloway came to the house by the docks. He put a bandage on the cut. He said she will be fine, but she must rest." Arthur memorized the name. Dr. Holloway. This was a very important clue. He waited until the men moved deeper into the warehouse and went down the stairs to the cellar. The room became quiet again. Arthur moved from behind the cabinets. He ran to the small window and climbed back out. He landed on the wet ground and quickly walked away from the river. The fog was still very thick and cold. Arthur walked for 10 minutes until he reached a street with more gas lamps. He found a small house with a green door. A wooden sign above the door said, "Dr. Holloway." There was a light in the window. Arthur knocked on the door. After a moment, a man opened it. He was an older man with white hair and gold glasses. He looked very tired and a little bit afraid. "Is it an emergency?" "I am Arthur Pendergast, a private investigator," Arthur said. He showed his identification card. "I am looking for a woman with a hand injury. She was brought to see you tonight." The doctor looked at the empty street behind Arthur. He pulled his coat tight around his neck. "I do not want any trouble, sir. A very tall man came here. He had a lot of money and a very cold voice. He told me to help the lady and keep my mouth shut." "I only want to help her," Arthur said in a calm voice. "Was she wearing a blue dress?" The doctor nodded slowly. "Yes. It was a beautiful dress. But it was torn. Her hand had a deep cut from a metal wire or a rope. I cleaned the wound and used a white bandage. She looked very brave, but her eyes were full of fear. She tried to speak to me, but the man stopped her immediately." "Did she say anything at all?" Arthur asked. "She whispered one word when the man looked away," the doctor said. "She said Highgate." Then the man pulled her toward the door. They left in a black carriage about an hour ago. Arthur thanked the doctor. Highgate was a wealthy part of London, far from the docks. The mystery was moving from the river to the green hills of the city. He walked into the doctor's small waiting room to put on his gloves, and his eyes saw something on a small table. Arthur stood in the small waiting room of Dr. Halloway. The room was quiet. A small fire burned in the fireplace, but it did not make the room feel warm to Arthur. He felt a sense of danger. He looked down at the small table next to a wooden chair. On the table, there was a copy of a newspaper called the London Times. Arthur picked up the newspaper. It was from that very day. At first, it looked like a normal paper. There were stories about politics, the weather, and the theatre. But then, Arthur noticed something strange. Someone had used a dark pen to draw small circles around specific words on the front page. He held the paper close to the lantern light. He read the circled words one by one. The first word was Highgate. The second word was midnight. The third word was mansion. Arthur turned the page. He found more circles. He saw the words silver, garden, and gate. When he put all the words together, a secret message appeared. Highgate, midnight, mansion, silver, garden, gate. "This is a code," Arthur whispered. He looked at the doctor, who was still standing near the door. The doctor's face was pale. His hands were tucked deep into his pockets. "Dr. Halloway, who was reading this newspaper?" Arthur asked. He pointed to the circled words. The doctor walked over and looked at the paper. He sighed and shook his head. "The tall man with the cold voice. He sat in that chair while I was in the other room with the lady. He was very quiet. He must have done this while he waited." "Did he say anything about a mansion?" Arthur asked. "No," the doctor replied. "He only spoke about the lady's hand. But I remember he looked at his pocket watch many times. He seemed to be in a great hurry." Arthur felt the weight of the mystery. The Silver Circle was not just a group of street thieves. They were organized. They used newspapers to send messages to each other. This meant there were more members of the group hidden all over London. Arthur knew he had very little time. He checked his own pocket watch. It was already past 10 o'clock. Highgate was a long way from the docks. It was a place where very rich people lived in large houses with big gardens. "Thank you, Doctor," Arthur said. "You have been very helpful. I suggest you lock your door tonight." Arthur put the newspaper in his pocket. He left the doctor's house and stepped back into the cold night. The fog was still there, but he could see the moon now. It was a thin, white curve in the sky. He began to walk toward the main road. He needed to find a carriage and a fast horse. He knew where he had to go. He had to go to Highgate. He had to find the mansion with the silver garden gate. He was sure that Elara was there, waiting in the dark. The detective was tired, but he did not stop. The game was becoming more dangerous, and the midnight hour was coming fast. Arthur did not go to Highgate immediately. He looked at the iron key in his hand. The letters RT were cold against his skin. He remembered the small wooden door in the theatre basement. He felt that the theatre still held the biggest secret. He took a carriage back to the Royal Theatre. The building was now dark and silent. The police were gone, but a single guard sat by the front entrance. Arthur did not use the front door. He went to the side and entered through the stage door. He walked quickly through the empty halls. His footsteps were the only sound in the large building. He reached the stage and opened the trapdoor again. He climbed down the ladder into the dark basement. The air in the basement was even colder than before. Arthur moved his lantern across the stone walls. He found the small wooden door he saw earlier. This door was near the area where he found Elara's earring. He looked at the lock. It was a large, old lock made of dark metal. Arthur took out the RT key. He put it into the lock. It fit perfectly. He turned the key. The metal made a heavy grinding sound. The lock opened. Arthur pushed the door. It was very heavy, but it moved slowly. Behind the door was not a room. It was a tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and very long. The walls were made of old bricks. Water dripped from the ceiling, making small pools on the floor. The smell was terrible. It smelled of wet earth and very old air. Arthur stepped inside. He had to lower his head because the ceiling was very low. "This is not a theatre tunnel," Arthur whispered. "This is an old city tunnel." He walked for a long time. The light from his lantern was the only thing he could see. He looked at the floor. He saw more footprints in the mud. Some were large, and some were small. He also saw a piece of white cloth on a sharp stone. He picked it up. It was a piece of a bandage. It was clean and white. Elara was here. He thought. They took her through the dark. The tunnel began to go up. After another 100 steps, Arthur saw a wooden ceiling above him. There was a small ladder leading to a square door in the roof of the tunnel. Arthur climbed the ladder and pushed the door. He stepped out into a small, dusty room. There were old boxes and broken chairs everywhere. He looked out of a small, dirty window. He was no longer at the theatre. He was inside a small building near the river docks. This was the Riverside Trading Warehouse again. The tunnel connected the theatre directly to the docks. Arthur realized the truth. The Silver Circle did not use the streets to kidnap Elara. They used the secret paths under London. They could move people and stolen diamonds without anyone seeing them. He was now back where he started. But he knew much more. He knew the way they moved. Arthur stood in the dusty room of the Riverside Trading Warehouse. The air was very still. He held his lantern low so the light did not reach the window. He did not want anyone outside to see him. He looked at the old boxes and the broken furniture. In the far corner of the room, he saw a pile of dirty blankets. The blankets moved. Arthur walked toward the corner. He held his wooden cane in his hand. "Is someone there?" he asked in a quiet but firm voice. A head appeared from under the blankets. It was a man. He was very old. His hair was white and messy. His face was covered in the dust of the warehouse. He wore a coat that was too big for him. The man looked at Arthur with wide, frightened eyes. He did not speak. He looked like he wanted to run, but he was too tired. "Do not be afraid," Arthur said. He put his lantern on a wooden crate. "I am a detective. I am looking for a woman. She was brought through the tunnel tonight." The old man looked at the trapdoor in the floor. He slowly sat up. His hands were thin and they shook a little. Many people come and go through that door. The man whispered. His voice was dry like old paper. They think I am a shadow. They think I see nothing. But you saw them tonight, didn't you? Arthur asked. He sat on a box near the man. The old man nodded. I saw two men. One was very tall. He wore a long coat and a dark hat. The other man was shorter and walked with a limp. They were carrying a lady. She wore a dress as blue as the sea. It had silver stones that sparkled even in the dark. Arthur felt a spark of excitement. Did she say anything? Was she hurt? She was not speaking. The witness said. She looked like she was sleeping, but her eyes were open. Her hand was wrapped in a white cloth. There was a little bit of red on the cloth. The tall man was very angry. He told the shorter man to move faster. Where did they go? Arthur asked. The old man pointed to the main door of the warehouse. They went to the black carriage. I heard the horses on the street. They said a name. They talked about a place called the Blue Bell. It is a tavern near the bridge. Arthur knew the Blue Bell. It was a place where sailors and workers went to drink. It was a loud and crowded place. It was a good place for a criminal to hide in a crowd. Thank you, Arthur said. He reached into his pocket and found a silver coin. He gave it to the old man. You have been very helpful. Why do you stay here in the dark? The streets are cold, and the police do not like men like me. The old man replied. He looked at the coin. Here, the shadows are my friends. But tonight, the shadows were cold. Those men were not good men. The old man reached into the pile of blankets. He pulled out a small object. The tall man dropped this when he was fighting with the door. He said. The old man's hand shook as he held out a small, shiny object. Arthur took it carefully and held it up to the light of his lantern. It was a small pin made of bright, polished silver. It was shaped like a perfect circle. There were no letters or names on it, but the metal was cold and heavy for its size. The silver circle. Arthur whispered. This was the physical proof he needed. It was not just a name or a rumor. It was a mark. The men who took Elara belonged to a secret society that used this symbol. The pin was elegant, which suggested the group had money and power. It was far too expensive for a common street thief to own. They are powerful men, sir, the old man whispered, pulling his blankets back over his shoulders. They have friends in high places and friends in the dark alleys. You should be careful. They do not like people who follow them. Arthur put the pin in his pocket next to the RT key and the coded newspaper. Thank you. Stay safe, he said. Arthur stepped out of the warehouse and back into the freezing London night. The fog was starting to lift, replaced by a fine, cold drizzle. He walked quickly away from the river, his boots splashing in the mud. He needed to reach the Blue Bell Tavern. If the kidnappers had stopped there, someone might know which direction the carriage had turned. The Blue Bell was a low, squat building near the edge of the London Bridge. Unlike the quiet warehouse, this place was loud, even from the street. Arthur could hear the sound of a piano and the roar of many voices. The smell of cheap ale and thick tobacco smoke spilled out every time the door opened. Arthur entered and kept his hat low. He did not want to be recognized as a detective. The room was crowded with sailors, dock workers, and men who looked like they lived in the shadows. He walked to the wooden bar and caught the eye of the barman, a large man with a broken nose. A black carriage stopped here half an hour ago, Arthur said, sliding a silver coin across the wet wood. 2 men and a woman. Which way did they go? The barman looked at the coin, then at Arthur. He wiped the bar with a dirty cloth. They didn't stay to drink. The tall one came in to talk to a man in the back room, a fellow named the captain. When he came out, they headed south over the bridge. They seemed in a hurry. South? Arthur frowned. Highgate was to the north. Why would they go the opposite way? Suddenly, Arthur noticed a man sitting in the far corner of the tavern. The man wore a dirty brown coat and sat with one leg stretched out stiffly. He had a noticeable limp. He was watching Arthur with narrow, suspicious eyes. On the man's table sat a black hat, and on his sleeve, Arthur saw a tiny piece of white thread, a fiber from a fresh bandage. The man realized Arthur had spotted him. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over. He didn't head for the front door. He bolted through a small exit behind the piano. Arthur did not hesitate. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the angry shouts of the drinkers, and ran after the man with the limp. Arthur burst through the narrow back door of the Blue Bell and was immediately swallowed by the cold, damp air of the alley. The transition from the loud, smoky tavern to the deathly quiet of the docks was jarring. He stopped for a second, his heart hammering against his ribs, and listened. To his left, the sound of a heavy, uneven footfall echoed against the brick walls. The man with the limp was not running. He was moving with a desperate, frantic rhythm. Arthur sprinted. The ground was slick with river mud and spilled oil, making every step a gamble. The fog had returned with a vengeance, thick and yellow, smelling of coal smoke and the sulphur of the Thames. It felt like running through a cloud of wet wool. He could see only a few feet in front of him, but the sound of the limp guided him like a beacon. "Stop!" Arthur shouted, his voice muffled by the mist. The footsteps ahead quickened. The man turned a sharp corner into a passage so narrow that Arthur's shoulders brushed against the freezing stone on both sides. He rounded the corner just in time to see a shadow disappear behind a stack of tall wooden barrels. Arthur slowed his pace, gripping his heavy cane. He moved silently now, his eyes scanning the gloom. He reached the barrels and peered around them. The alley opened up into a small, derelict courtyard overlooking the river. The water was a black void, lapping hungrily at the rotten wooden pilings of the pier. The man was there, standing at the edge of the pier. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving under his dirty brown coat. He looked trapped. Behind him was the drop into the freezing, deep water of the Thames. "It's over," Arthur said, stepping into the dim light of a lone, flickering gas lamp. "You have nowhere to go. Tell me where they took Elara." The man turned. In the yellow light, his face was a mask of pure terror. He wasn't the tall, confident man in the silver mask. He was a common thug, a man who had clearly realized he was in over his head. "I can't tell you." The man wheezed, clutching his stiff leg. "If I talk, the circle, they'll do worse than the river to me." "The circle is already failing," Arthur countered, taking a step forward. "I have the key. I have the pin. I know about Highgate. If you help me, I can protect you from the police." The man looked at the water, then back at Arthur. For a moment, it looked like he might speak. His lips parted, but then his eyes widened as he looked at something over Arthur's shoulder. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the air, a signal. From the shadows of the warehouse behind Arthur, the black carriage emerged, its wheels silent on the soft mud. The driver, a man completely draped in black, didn't stop. He lashed the horses, and the carriage surged forward toward the pier. "Jump!" Arthur yelled, realizing the carriage wasn't stopping for the man. It was aiming for him. But the man with the limp was too slow. He tried to scramble away, but his stiff leg betrayed him. The carriage swept past Arthur, nearly clipping his arm, and headed straight for the informant. Just as the horses reached him, a hand reached out from the carriage window and shoved the man. With a choked cry, The man fell backward off the pier. A loud splash followed, then silence. The carriage didn't slow down. It veered sharply and disappeared back into the thick fog of the main road. Arthur ran to the edge of the pier, peering into the black water. The mist was too thick to see anything. The man was gone, taken by the current and the shadows of the river. Arthur stood on the edge of the pier for a heartbeat, staring into the swirling black eddies of the Thames. He wanted to jump in, to save the man with the limp. But he knew the current was too strong and the fog was too thick. The man was likely gone, another secret swallowed by the river. If Arthur stayed, he would lose the only lead he had left, the black carriage. He turned and sprinted back through the alley toward the main road near the bridge. His lungs burned in the cold air. Luckily, a lone hansom cab was dropping off a passenger near the entrance of the Blue Bell. "Follow that carriage," Arthur shouted, leaping onto the step before the passenger had even fully exited. "The black one heading north. £5 if you don't lose them." The driver, a grizzled man in a leather hat, didn't ask questions. He whipped the horse, and the cab jerked forward with a violent snap. "Hold on, governor. It's a soup out there tonight." The chase was a nightmare of sound and shadow. The black carriage had a head start and was moving with terrifying speed. Because of its silent, rubber-rimmed wheels, a luxury few could afford, it didn't rattle like a normal coach. It moved like a ghost through the yellow mist. Arthur leaned out of the window, squinting against the stinging drizzle. "There!" Arthur pointed. A flicker of red light from the carriage's rear lamp appeared briefly as it rounded a corner onto Bishopsgate. The driver urged his horse faster. The sound of hooves on the wet cobblestones was like a hammer on an anvil, echoing loudly against the shuttered shops. They raced past silent warehouses and sleeping tenements. Twice, they nearly collided with vegetable carts heading for the early morning markets. As they moved away from the river, the air grew thinner and the fog began to drift into long, wispy fingers. They were heading north, climbing the steady incline toward the wealthier districts. The houses here were larger, separated by iron fences and stone walls. "They're pushing those horses hard, sir," the driver yelled down through the trapdoor in the roof. "They're heading for the Highgate rise." Arthur gripped the leather strap inside the cab. Highgate. The word from the newspaper and the doctor was now a reality. The Silver Circle wasn't hiding in a slum. They were hiding in plain sight, among the lords and ladies of London. Suddenly, the black carriage veered sharply off the main road and onto a private, tree-lined lane. The trees were tall and leafless, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the moonlight. The hansom cab slowed down as the road became narrower and darker. "Stop here," Arthur ordered, tapping his cane against the roof. "But we haven't caught 'em, sir. If we go any further, they'll hear us," Arthur whispered. He climbed out of the cab and handed the driver the promised £5. "Wait for me at the bottom of the hill. If I'm not back by dawn, find Inspector Reed at Scotland Yard." The driver nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of greed and fear. He turned the cab around and vanished into the darkness. Arthur stood alone in the middle of the lane. Silence returned to the night, broken only by the distant, rhythmic panting of a horse. He walked forward, his boots silent on the damp grass at the edge of the road. Up ahead, through the trees, he saw the outline of a massive stone house. It sat on the hill like a fortress. And there, at the entrance to the driveway, stood a gate made of polished metal that caught the moonlight with a cold, white glare. It was the Silver Garden Gate. The mansion was a dark silhouette against the pale, bruised sky of the early morning. It was a Gothic beast of a house, all sharp angles, stone gargoyles, and narrow windows that looked like unblinking eyes. Arthur stood before the Silver Gate. It was even more impressive up close, not made of solid silver, but iron coated in a thick, shimmering silver leaf that glowed with an unnatural light. In the center of the two gates, the bars curved to form a large, perfect circle. It was the same symbol as the pin in Arthur's pocket. Arthur reached out and touched the metal. It was ice cold. He tried to push it, but it was locked with a heavy chain and a padlock that looked brand new. He didn't want to make noise by climbing the gate itself. The metal might groan, and the silver finish would likely flake off, leaving a trail. Instead, he moved along the perimeter of the stone wall that surrounded the estate. The wall was high, topped with jagged pieces of broken glass to keep out intruders. Arthur walked nearly 50 yards until he found an old oak tree whose thick branches reached over the stone. He pulled himself up, the rough bark scraping his palms. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent many nights in places he wasn't supposed to be. From the top of the wall, he looked down into the garden. It was a maze of dead hedges and white marble statues that looked like ghosts in the mist. He dropped onto the soft, damp soil on the other side. He stayed low, moving from the shadow of one statue to the next. He passed a stone angel whose face had been worn away by time. He reached the edge of the wide, gravel driveway. The black carriage was there, parked near the side entrance of the mansion. The horses had been taken to the stables, but the carriage was still warm. He could see the faint steam rising from its wooden roof in the cold air. Arthur looked up at the house. Most of the windows were dark, but on the second floor, a single room was filled with a warm, flickering light. Suddenly, the front door of the mansion opened. Arthur pressed himself flat against the wet earth behind a boxwood hedge. Two men stepped out onto the stone porch. One was the tall man in the long coat. The other was a man Arthur hadn't seen before, older, with white hair and a purple velvet smoking jacket. He carried a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses. "Is she secured?" the older man asked. His voice was upper-class, arrogant, and perfectly calm. "She is in the north room, Lord Harrington," the tall man replied. The doctor saw to her hand. "She's quiet, but she won't stay that way for long. She's a fighter." Lord Harrington took a sip from his glass. "She is a star, after all. Stars are meant to be kept in beautiful cages. And the sea star necklace in the safe, as you requested." Arthur's grip tightened on his cane. Lord Harrington, the name from the theatre, the donor of the diamonds, was the master of the Silver Circle. The man who pretended to be Elara's greatest fan was her captor. "Good," Harrington said, turning back toward the warmth of the house. "Dispose of the carriage before dawn. I don't want any link to the docks remaining on my property." The men went back inside, and the heavy oak door clicked shut. Arthur looked at the house. He knew where she was now, the north room. But how to get to the second floor of a fortress? Arthur stood in the shadows of the garden, his eyes fixed on the illuminated window of the north room. The mansion's stone walls were smooth and cold, offering few handholds. However, a thick trellis of old ivy crawled up the side of the house, its twisted wooden vines clinging to the masonry like the fingers of a giant. He took off his heavy wool coat and hid it beneath a nearby bush. He needed to be light and fast. With his cane hooked firmly into his belt, Arthur began the climb. The ivy was strong, but the rain had made the leaves slick. Twice, his foot slipped, and he had to freeze, pressing his chest against the stone to keep from falling. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. He was no longer a young man, and his muscles burned with the effort. Below him, the garden looked like a sea of grey mist. If he fell now, the mystery of the silent stage would end on the gravel driveway. Finally, he reached the stone ledge of the second-floor window. He pulled himself up and peered through the glass. The room was a library, filled from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across the rug. In a high-backed velvet chair sat Elara. She was still wearing the blue stage dress, though it was torn and stained with dust. Her right hand was wrapped in a thick white bandage, just as the doctor had said. She wasn't crying. She was staring into the fire with an expression of cold, hard defiance. Arthur tapped gently on the glass. Elara jumped, her eyes wide with terror. She looked toward the door, then slowly toward the window. When she saw Arthur's face, she gasped, covering her mouth with her bandaged hand. She ran to the window and struggled with the latch. It was old and rusted, but with a final, desperate shove, it swung open. "Mr. Pendergast," she whispered, her voice trembling. How did you find me?" "The fog has a way of leaving trails for those who know how to look," Arthur said, pulling himself over the sill and into the warmth of the room. He felt the soft carpet beneath his boots, a stark contrast to the mud and river water of the docks. "You must go," Elara urged, grabbing his arm. "Lord Harrington. He isn't the man people think he is. He is the head of the circle. They are planning to take me to a ship at dawn. They want to make sure I never speak of what I saw." "What did you see, Elara?" Arthur asked, looking her in the eye. "It wasn't just about the debt," she said, her voice dropping to a low hiss. "I found a ledger in the theatre manager's office. Harrington isn't just a donor. He's been using the theatre to move stolen goods from the docks into the city. The Sea Star necklace. It wasn't a gift. It was a payment for a shipment of opium." Arthur felt the pieces of the puzzle click into place. The theatre was a front. The kidnapping was a silencing tactic, and the Silver Circle was a smuggling empire. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the library door. The brass handle began to turn slowly. "Hide," Elara whispered, pointing toward a large tapestry on the far wall. Arthur stepped behind the heavy velvet tapestry just as the library door groaned open. The fabric smelled of ancient dust and cedar. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall, holding his breath. Through a tiny gap between the threads of the tapestry, which depicted a medieval hunting scene, he watched the room. Lord Harrington walked in. He had removed his smoking jacket and now wore a dark travelling coat. His face was no longer the mask of a polite gentleman. It was sharp and predatory. He was followed by the tall man, whose shadow stretched long across the library floor. "It is time, Elara," Harrington said, his voice smooth as silk. "The carriage is being prepared for the final journey. We leave for the docks in 20 minutes. The Vesper sails with the tide." Elara stood her ground, her chin tilted up. "The police will find you, my lord. Arthur Pendergast is already looking." Harrington laughed, a cold, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Pendergast is likely at the bottom of the Thames by now. My men informed me of a small accident at the pier. He was a clever man, but the fog is very unforgiving." Arthur felt a surge of cold anger, but he remained perfectly still. He needed to wait for the right moment. As he shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushed against something behind the tapestry. It was not flat stone. It was a cold, iron ring bolted into the wall. He ran his fingers over it. It was a lever. In the room, Harrington stepped closer to Elara. "Don't be difficult. You are a valuable asset. Once we are in France, you will realize that a life of luxury is better than the dusty boards of a theatre stage. Thomas, fetch the Sea Star from the study. I want her wearing it when we board." The tall man, Thomas, nodded and left the room. Harrington turned his back to the tapestry to look into the fireplace, perhaps savoring his victory. Arthur took the chance. He pulled the iron ring. There was no loud noise, only the soft, oiled slide of stone on stone. A section of the wall behind the tapestry pivoted inward. It was a secret door, a hidden artery of the old mansion. Arthur didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbed Elara's hand, and pulled her behind the tapestry before she could even gasp. "What?" Harrington spun around, hearing the faint rustle. By the time he reached the tapestry and tore it aside, the stone wall had already clicked back into place. To his eyes, it was nothing but solid, immovable masonry. On the other side, Arthur and Elara were plunged into total darkness. The air was thin and smelled of limestone. "Stay close to me," Arthur whispered, feeling the wall for a guide. "This house is built like the theater. It has a backstage." "Where does this lead?" Elara asked, her voice a tiny thread in the dark. "Usually, these paths lead to the cellar or the stables," Arthur replied. "Harrington thinks he's trapped us, but he's forgotten one thing. A detective knows that the most important parts of a building are the ones you cannot see." They began to move down a narrow set of stone stairs. Far below, Arthur could hear a strange, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a steam engine, or perhaps the heavy machinery used for moving crates. They were not just in a house. They were in a warehouse disguised as a home. The stone stairs ended in a heavy iron door. Arthur pushed it open slowly, and the two stepped into a space that looked nothing like the elegant library above. This was a vast, subterranean workshop lit by the low hiss of gas jets fixed to the damp stone pillars. The air was thick with the smell of vinegar, metallic dust, and something sweet and cloying, opium. "Look," Elara whispered, pointing to long wooden tables. The tables were covered in tools, jeweler's saws, magnifying glasses, and small trays of sparkling stones. On the floor were dozens of wooden crates, all stamped with the familiar black RT of riverside trading. This wasn't just a hiding place for a kidnapped actress. It was a factory for the Silver Circle's illicit business. Arthur walked to the nearest table. He picked up a small glass vial filled with a dark, sticky liquid. "The doctor said you were being moved to a ship." "Elara, they aren't just smuggling people. They are taking raw opium from the docks, refining it here in the heart of Highgate, and sending it back out as high-priced medicine, or hidden inside jewelry." "And the diamonds?" Elara asked, her eyes moving to a small, velvet-lined box in the center of the table. Arthur opened the box. Inside lay the sea star necklace. Even in the dim light of the workshop, the central blue sapphire pulsed with a deep, oceanic fire. But as Arthur held it up, he noticed something strange. The sapphire was loose. He touched the stone, and it pivoted on a tiny hinge, revealing a hollow compartment inside. "It's a vessel," Arthur said, his voice grim. The most famous necklace in London was being used to carry the most dangerous secrets out of the country. Suddenly, the rhythmic thumping Arthur had heard earlier stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. From the far end of the workshop, near a set of heavy double doors that likely led to the stables, they heard a voice. "I don't care if the wall is solid. Find the mechanism." It was Lord Harrington, his voice distorted by rage and echoing through the stone chambers. "If they aren't in the library, they must be in the foundations." "We have to move," Arthur said, tucked the necklace into his pocket. He looked around the workshop. There were no windows here, only the door they had entered through and the double doors where the villains were likely heading. Then, he spotted a small, iron-grated opening in the floor, a drainage pipe for the chemical waste. It was narrow, but it led toward the outer walls of the estate. "It will be tight, and it will be filthy," Arthur warned, looking at Elara's silk dress. "I've performed in worse places than a saw, Mr. Pendergast," Elara replied, her eyes flashing with a bit of her stage-given strength. "Let's go." Arthur knelt on the cold stone floor, jamming the head of his heavy cane into the space between the iron grate and the floor. He leaned back, his muscles straining. With a sharp crack of breaking rust, the grate moved. He heaved it upward and slid the heavy metal lid across the stone. Below lay a narrow, sloping pipe made of smooth, dark brick. It was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. A shallow stream of dark, chemical-smelling water trickled down the center. "Go first," Arthur whispered. "It's a steep drop, but the water will help you slide. I'll be right behind you." Elara didn't hesitate. She gathered the hem of her ruined silk dress, tucked it around her legs, and lowered herself into the hole. For a moment, she disappeared into the blackness. Arthur heard the soft splash and the sound of her sliding down the brick. "I'm down." Her voice echoed back, muffled and distant. "It's tight, but it moves." Arthur looked back at the double doors. The handles were rattling violently. He dropped into the pipe. The space was terrifyingly small. The air was thick with the scent of wet lime and the bitter tang of the workshop's waste. He pushed himself forward, his shoulders scraping against the bricks. He felt like he was being swallowed by the house itself. Behind him, the double doors in the workshop burst open. "There!" "The grate!" Thomas's voice roared. It was followed by the heavy thud of boots running across the stone. Arthur moved faster, using his elbows to propel himself down the slope. The pipe curved sharply to the left, and suddenly the angle became much steeper. He began to slide, the speed picking up. He felt the cold sludge soaking into his clothes. He reached out to slow himself, but the bricks were too slick. Suddenly, the darkness broke. A small circle of grey light appeared ahead. Arthur burst out of the end of the pipe and tumbled onto a bed of wet leaves and soft mud. They were outside the mansion's walls, at the bottom of a steep, wooded ravine that bordered the Highgate estate. Above them, the stone wall of the manor loomed like a cliff. The morning was finally beginning to break, turning the sky a pale, ghostly blue. "Mr. Pendergast." Elara was standing a few feet away, her face smudged with soot and her hair tangled with dead leaves. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright. "We made it." "Not yet," Arthur said, standing up and brushing the mud from his coat. He looked up at the wall. High above, at the edge of the estate, he could see the orange glow of lanterns moving through the trees. Thomas and his men were coming. "They know the grounds better than we do. We need to reach the main road before the sun is fully up." He felt the heavy weight of the sea star necklace in his pocket. It was the proof they needed, but it was also a target on their backs. "Which way?" Elara asked. "The river," Arthur replied. "If we can find the old coaching path, we can get back to the city. But we must stay off the roads. Harrington will have his carriage out in minutes." As they began to run through the thick undergrowth, a long, low whistle echoed from the top of the ridge. The hunt had moved from the house to the woods. The Highgate woods were a tangle of silver birch and ancient oak, suffocated by a low-hanging morning mist. The air was so cold it felt like breathing glass. Arthur led the way, his boots sinking into the rot of last autumn's leaves. Behind him, Elara moved with a quiet desperation, her breath coming in ragged plumes. "Listen," Arthur whispered, raising a hand. From the ridge above, the sound of the hunt changed. The human shouts were joined by a deep, rhythmic baying. Hounds. Harrington wasn't just sending men. He was using dogs to track the scent of the chemicals they had picked up in the waste pipe. "They have dogs," Elara gasped, her face pale. "We can't outrun them on foot." "We don't have to outrun them," Arthur said, his mind racing through the geography of the area. "We only have to lose the scent." He spotted a narrow stream cutting through the bottom of the ravine. The water was shallow and choked with black stones. He grabbed Elara's arm and pulled her toward the freezing water. "Step only on the stones where you can, but keep your feet in the flow," he commanded. They waded into the stream. The cold was immediate and agonizing, soaking through their boots and numbing their ankles. They moved downstream for 100 yards, the sound of the hounds growing louder and more frantic as they reached the end of the waste pipe. Arthur led them to a spot where a massive willow tree had fallen across the water. Beneath its tangled roots was a small, dry hollow. They huddled into the darkness of the roots. The dogs would reach the stream and lose the trail, but the men would search the banks. A pair of heavy leather boots stopped just 3 feet from their hiding spot. Through the screen of hanging willow branches, Arthur saw the hem of a dark coat. It was Thomas. He held a lantern that looked weak against the growing light of the sun. The man stood perfectly still, listening. Arthur felt Elara trembling. He reached out and squeezed her hand, a silent plea for absolute stillness. "Anything." A voice called out from the ridge. "Nothing." Thomas shouted back, his voice thick with frustration. "The scent dies at the water. They must have headed toward the coaching road." The boots turned and moved away, the sound of the hounds fading as the handlers pulled them toward the higher ground. Arthur waited until the silence was absolute, broken only by the chatter of a distant bird. "We have to move now," Arthur said, helping Elara out from the hollow. "They'll realize the trick soon. The coaching road is a trap, but there is an old cemetery further down the hill. If we can reach the gates, we can find the milk wagons heading into the city." He looked at Elara. Her bandaged hand was starting to bleed through again. She was reaching her limit. He pulled the sea star necklace from his pocket, the blue stone catching a stray beam of dawn light. "Keep this," he said, pressing it into her good hand. "If we are separated, get to the police. Show them the hidden hinge. It's the key to everything." "We won't be separated," she replied, her voice regaining its theatrical strength. "I haven't finished the final act yet." The edge of the woods gave way to a paved road just as the sun began to burn through the last of the Highgate mist. The world was waking up in shades of grey and pale gold. Arthur and Elara crouched behind a stone wall, their clothes damp and streaked with the mud of the ravine. In the distance, the chimneys of London were beginning to puff out their morning smoke. The rhythmic clop-clop of a heavy horse echoed down the road. A large, white-painted wagon appeared, the glass milk bottles inside rattling. The driver was a stout man in a flat cap, whistling a jaunty tune that felt entirely too cheerful for the circumstances. "Wait here," Arthur whispered to Elara. He stepped out into the road, straightening his disheveled waistcoat as best he could. He raised his cane, not as a weapon, but as a signal. The wagon slowed to a halt, the horse huffing a cloud of steam into the cold air. "Morning, Governor," the driver said, squinting at Arthur's mud-stained trousers. "You look like you've had a bit of a tumble in the ditch." "An unfortunate encounter with a very enthusiastic dog and a very steep hill," Arthur replied, his voice regaining its polished, witty edge. "My sister and I have had a carriage accident. We need to get to the city immediately. I find myself without a vehicle, but with a surplus of silver." Arthur held up a crown. The driver's eyes widened. A crown was worth more than a week's worth of milk deliveries. "Well now," the driver said, leaning down. "Barney's the name. I'm heading down to Camden and then the Strand. It'll be a bumpy ride on the back. Mind you, bumpy is better than stationary." "Barney," Arthur said. He signaled to Elara. She stepped out from the shadows, her ruined blue dress hidden beneath Arthur's heavy wool coat. Barney helped her up onto the bench, his expression softening at the sight of her bandaged hand. "Hurt yourself, did you, Missy?" "A minor theatrical mishap, Barney," she said, giving him a weary but genuine smile. "I'm afraid I'm a bit of a clumsy actress." They climbed into the back of the wagon, wedged between the cold metal milk cans. As the wagon lurched forward, Arthur peered through the wooden slats of the sideboards. A few minutes into the journey, the sound of galloping hooves approached from behind. Arthur pressed his eye to a gap in the wood. A black carriage, Lord Harrington's, thundered past them, the driver lashing the horses. It didn't even slow down to look at the humble milk wagon. The very men hunting them were racing toward the city to cut them off, never suspecting their star was sitting among the cream and butter. For the first time since the theatre lights went out, Arthur felt a moment of relief. He looked at Elara. She had fallen asleep against a milk crate, the sea star necklace clutched tightly in her hand. "We're almost there, Elara," Arthur whispered, though she couldn't hear him. The wagon rolled into the outskirts of London. The quiet of the hills was replaced by the roar of the waking city, the shouts of street vendors, the clatter of iron wheels, and the smell of coal and baking bread. They were not just returning to London, they were returning with the evidence to burn the silver circle to the ground. The milk wagon rattled to a halt a few blocks away from the Great Scotland Yard. The morning sun was now fully over the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the stone face of the police headquarters. Arthur helped Elara down from the wagon. They were a sight to behold, a detective covered in river mud and coal dust, and a famous actress in a torn stage dress, wrapped in an oversized, filthy wool coat. Barney, the milkman, tipped his cap. "Good luck to you, Missy. Hope your next play has a happier ending than this one." Arthur nodded his thanks and led Elara toward the heavy doors of the yard. The desk sergeant looked up, ready to tell two vagrants to move along, but he stopped when Arthur slammed his silver-topped cane onto the counter. "I am Arthur Pendergast," he said, his voice ringing through the lobby with a command that didn't match his appearance. "And this is Miss Elara of the Royal Theatre. Fetch Inspector Reed immediately. Tell him the silver circle has been broken." Minutes later, they were in Reed's private office. The inspector looked like he hadn't slept either. His desk was covered in half-empty teacups and reports of the carriage that had vanished near the docks. When he saw them, he dropped his pen in shock. "Pendergast. We found a man's body in the river near the Blue Bell. We thought you were next." "Not today, Reed," Arthur said, taking a seat and helping Elara into a chair. "The man in the river was an informant. The man who put him there is Lord Harrington." "Harrington?" Reed gasped. "The philanthropist. The man is a pillar of London society. He is a pillar of a smuggling empire," Arthur corrected. He reached into his pocket and placed the sea star necklace on the desk. "Look closely at the central stone." As Reed watched, Arthur pressed the hidden catch. The blue sapphire pivoted, revealing the hollow chamber inside. The faint, sweet scent of refined opium drifted into the room. Arthur laid out the rest of the puzzle pieces on the mahogany desk. The silver pin. The mark of the secret society. The RT key. The link between the Royal Theatre and Riverside trading. The ledger. Elara explained how Harrington used the theatre's accounts to launder the money from the opium trade. He didn't just want the diamonds. Reed. Arthur explained. He wanted to silence the woman who discovered his secret workshop beneath his own home. He's using the Sea Star to move high-grade opium to the continent. Reed stood up, his face hardening. If this is true, and the necklace says it is, then Harrington is finished. I'll have 24 men at Highgate before the clock strikes 10. A week later, the fog had lifted from London. The papers were full of the scandal of the century. Lord Harrington was in a cell at Newgate, and the Silver Circle had been dismantled. Arthur stood at the back of the Royal Theatre. The stage was bright again, and the smell of white roses had returned. Elara stood in the center of the stage, her hands still bandaged but her voice stronger than ever. The audience roared with applause as she took her final bow. She caught Arthur's eye in the shadows of the wings and gave a small, graceful nod of thanks. Arthur turned and walked out into the cool evening air of the Strand. He lit a cigarette, the match flame flickering in the twilight. His clothes were clean, his cane was polished, and his mind was already wandering toward the next shadow in the corner of the city. A fine performance. He whispered to the night. But I think I prefer the silence of a closed case. The arrest of Lord Harrington had sent a shockwave through London. But for Arthur Pendergast, the victory felt hollow. He sat in his study, the embers in the fireplace glowing like dying eyes. On his desk lay a single, charred playing card, the ace of spades, found in the pocket of one of Harrington's guards. It was marked with a small, crimson fingerprint. "It isn't over, is it?" a voice asked from the doorway. Arthur looked up. It was Elara. She was dressed in a simple traveling suit, her stage makeup replaced by the pale, tired look of a woman who had seen too much. The Sea Star scandal had made her the most famous woman in England, but she sought no more spotlight. Harrington was a financier. Elara, Arthur said, tapping the card with his fingernail. He provided the houses and the connections. But he was not the man who designed the masks. He was not the man who killed the informant at the pier. Then who was? She asked, stepping into the room. A man the underworld calls the architect. Arthur replied. He builds the systems that allow men like Harrington to thrive. And according to my sources, he is unhappy that his finest bridge, the Silver Circle, has collapsed. A heavy knock sounded at the front door. Arthur didn't move. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver, checking the cylinder. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of glass shattering in the hallway. "Stay behind the desk," Arthur commanded. He crept toward the door, his boots silent on the Persian rug. The hallway was filled with the smell of lamp oil. Someone had smashed the lantern on the wall. In the flickering darkness, Arthur saw a tall, thin figure standing by the broken front door. The man wasn't wearing a silver mask. He wore a simple burlap hood with 2 holes cut for eyes. "Pendergast," the figure whispered. The voice was like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You have cost us a great deal of capital." "I have a habit of being an expensive guest," Arthur retorted, raising his weapon. The hooded man didn't flinch. He held up a small, brass object, a clockwork device that was ticking rapidly. "The architect sends his regards. He says that if you cannot be bought, you must be recycled." The man tossed the device into the center of the room. It hissed, releasing a thick, purple gas that smelled of rotting violets. Arthur fired, but the hooded figure had already vanished into the fog of the street. Arthur grabbed Elara and pulled her toward the open window. The gas was rising, turning the air into a toxic haze. They tumbled out onto the wet grass of the garden just as a muffled explosion rocked the house. The windows of Arthur's study blew outward in a shower of glass and fire. Standing in the street, Arthur watched his home burn. He felt no sadness, only a cold, sharpening focus. The Silver Circle was dead, but the architect had just revealed himself. "The game has changed, Elara," Arthur said, his face illuminated by the flames. "We are no longer the hunters. We are the prey." As the fire brigade's horses thundered toward his burning home, Arthur and Elara vanished into the network of alleys behind the main street. They could not go to Scotland Yard. If the architect could find Arthur's private residence within hours of Harrington's arrest, then the police force was likely compromised. "We need a place to hide," Elara whispered, her breath hitching. The smoke from the explosion had left a bitter taste in her throat. "I have a contact in 7 Dials," Arthur replied, steering her through the labyrinth of the London slums. An apothecary who deals in truths as often as he deals in tinctures. He specializes in the very chemicals we smelled in that purple gas. Seven Dials was a place where the sun rarely touched the ground. The buildings leaned inward, their roofs almost touching across the narrow lanes. They reached a sagging storefront with a faded sign of a mortar and pestle. The windows were caked with soot, and the door hung on a single, rusted hinge. This was the shop of Silas Vane. As they entered, the interior was a forest of glass jars, dried herbs, and hanging animal skeletons. In the back, sitting behind a counter piled high with yellowed parchment, was Silas. He was a man who looked like he was made of parchment himself, thin, wrinkled, and covered in ink stains. Pendergast. Silas wheezed without looking up. I heard your house went up. Fast work, even for the architect's men. You knew it was coming? Arthur asked, his eyes scanning the shadows of the shop. The word on the street moves faster than the flames. Arthur, the purple gas you encountered, that's a specialty. It's called the widow's sigh. It's a nerve agent. Highly concentrated, very expensive, and very deadly. Silas finally looked up, his eyes milky. You're lucky to be breathing. Who supplied the components for it? Silas. Arthur leaned over the counter, his voice a low growl. Silas reached into a drawer and pulled out a ledger. He flipped through the pages until he reached a section marked with a black seal. The sulfur and the violet essence were purchased 3 days ago by a firm called the Iron Weaver. They operate out of an old foundry in Blackfriars. The Iron Weaver. Arthur repeated. A fitting name for an architect. Be careful, Arthur. Silas warned, sliding a small glass vial of clear liquid across the counter. This is an antidote of sorts. If you smell violets again, drink this. It won't save you, but it might give you enough time to pull a trigger. Suddenly, the sound of rhythmic tapping came from the street. It was the sound of a cane, but it wasn't a gentleman's stroll. It was steady, mechanical, and cold. Silas's face went white. He's here. Silas whispered, his voice trembling. He doesn't like loose ends, and I just gave you a thread. Arthur pulled Elara behind a heavy shelf of lead jars. He checked his revolver. The front door of the apothecary shop creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and a mask made not of silver, but of polished brass, shaped into the face of a weeping clock. The man in the brass mask stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the sickly yellow light of the 7 dials. The mask was a marvel of terrifying engineering. Tiny gears whirred behind the eye slits, and the mouth was a grill of dark metal that vibrated when he spoke. The sound was not human. It was a resonant, metallic hum that seemed to vibrate in Arthur's very teeth. Silas Vane. The masked man said, the brass lips unmoving. Your ledgers have always been a liability. The architect prizes discretion above all other virtues. Silas cowered behind the counter, his gnarled hands clutching the edge of the wood. I told him nothing. I swear on the graves of my fathers. Your fathers are already dust. Silas. Soon, you shall join them in the mortar. The masked man raised a hand. He wasn't carrying a gun or a blade. Instead, he held a small, brass cylinder connected to his sleeve by a series of thin, leather tubes. A faint hissing sound filled the cramped shop. Arthur didn't wait for the man to fire. He stepped out from behind the shelf and fired his revolver. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, but there was no spray of blood, only a sharp clang and a shower of sparks. The figure didn't even flinch. He was wearing a suit of articulated plate armor beneath his fine silk coat. Steel is a primitive solution. Mr. Pendergast. The metallic voice hummed. The man pointed the cylinder at Silas. A stream of high-pressure liquid erupted, hitting the apothecary full in the chest. It was not the purple gas. It was something clear and viscous. Silas screamed as his clothes began to smoke and char instantly. "Nitric acid!" Arthur shouted. He grabbed a heavy jar of baking soda from the shelf and hurled it at the masked figure's head. The jar shattered against the brass mask, blinding the assailant with white powder. Arthur used the distraction to lunge forward, grabbing Silas by the arm and dragging him toward the back exit. Elara followed, her eyes wide with horror as the apothecary's shop began to dissolve under the spray of the caustic liquid. They burst through the rear door into a muddy courtyard filled with rusted bird cages. Silas collapsed into the mud, gasping. His coat was half eaten away, and his skin was blistered, but he was alive. The foundry. Silas wheezed, clutching Arthur's sleeve. "It's not just a factory. It's a heart. The Iron Weaver. He's building something. Not just masks. A machine, to silence the city." "Who is he?" "Silas. Give me a name," Arthur demanded, hearing the heavy, rhythmic thud of the brass-masked man approaching the back door. "Ramsey." Silas choked out. "Julian Ramsey. The man who built the London saws. He knows the city's bones because he made them." A sudden explosion of glass and wood behind them signaled the arrival of the clockwork mask. The figure stepped into the courtyard, the white powder falling from his brass face like snow. Arthur turned, his revolver empty, his heart pounding. He looked at the bird cages, then at a heavy iron winch used for hauling grain to the upper lofts. He grabbed the release lever and pulled. The iron winch gave way with a shriek of protesting metal. A heavy wooden pallet, loaded with sacks of unprocessed minerals, swung down from the loft like a giant's fist. It struck the man in the brass mask with a sickening crunch. The force of the impact sent the armored figure flying backward through the apothecary's door, disappearing into the corrosive smoke of his own making. Arthur didn't stay to see if the man would rise. He hauled Silas to his feet while Elara gripped the old man's other side. They moved through the labyrinth of 7 dials, disappearing into the morning fog that was now thick with the smell of coal fires and baking bread. "Julian Ramsey," Arthur muttered as they reached the relative safety of an abandoned warehouse near the Fleet River. "The king of the underground." He was the lead engineer for the Great Stink of 58. He mapped the veins and arteries of this city before the police even had boots on the ground. If he built the saws, he knows every secret passage in London. Elara said, her voice shaking as she looked back toward the smoke rising from the dials. "He could be anywhere. He could be beneath our feet right now." Silas groaned, leaning against a damp brick wall. "It's worse than that, lady. He didn't just build the tunnels. He built the foundries that made the pipes. The Iron Weaver isn't just a nickname. He controls the metal that holds London together. The Silver Circle was just his bank. Now that the bank is closed, he's going to use the iron." Arthur looked at the small, clear vial Silas had given him. "He's building a machine, you said, to silence the city. What does that mean?" "The ventilation." Silas wheezed, his eyes rolling back in his head. "The new subway, the Metropolitan line. It breathes through the saws. If he pumps the widow's sigh through the vents, the whole of London goes to sleep, and they never wake up." The gravity of the situation settled over Arthur like a lead shroud. This was no longer about a kidnapped actress or a smuggling ring. It was about the life of the metropolis itself. Julian Ramsey was planning a chemical execution on a scale never before seen. "I need to get to the Blackfriars foundry," Arthur said, checking his empty revolver and searching the warehouse for anything he could use as a weapon. He found a heavy iron pry bar and a coil of wire. If that's the heart of his operation, that's where the machine must be. You can't go alone. Elara insisted. He knows your face. Arthur. He knows your methods. He knows a detective. Arthur replied, his eyes turning cold. He doesn't know a man with nothing left to lose. Silas. Where in the foundry would he hide a device of that size? The cooling tower. Silas whispered, his voice fading. It connects directly to the main shaft of the underground. But you'll never get past the iron guards. They aren't men. Arthur. They're clockwork and hate. As Silas slipped into unconsciousness, Arthur looked out at the city. The sun was struggling to pierce the smog. Somewhere beneath the streets, the iron weaver was spinning his final web. The Blackfriars district was a sprawling industrial graveyard of soot and iron, where the sky was perpetually bruised by the vomit of 1,000 chimneys. At its heart stood the foundry, a blackened cathedral of industry with windows like empty sockets. This was the fortress of Julian Ramsay, a place where the air tasted of copper and the ground thrummed with the rhythmic, heavy heartbeat of massive steam pistons. Arthur and Elara crouched behind a stack of rusted iron pipes near the loading docks. The iron guards Silas had warned them about were visible in the flickering orange glow of the furnace fires. They moved with a stiff, unnatural precision, their movements accompanied by the faint hiss of hydraulic steam. From a distance, they looked like men in heavy diving suits. But up close, the truth was more horrifying. They were hollow suits of articulated metal, driven by hidden gears and pressurized valves. They aren't human. Elara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. How can we fight something that doesn't breathe? We don't fight them. Arthur replied, tightening his grip on the heavy pry bar. We bypass them. Every machine has a pressure point. Elara. Ramsay might know the city's bones, but he's forgotten that bones are brittle. He pointed toward a massive, soot-stained brick cylinder that rose from the center of the foundry like a hollow tooth. This was the cooling tower. Great plumes of white steam billowed from its crown, disappearing into the London fog. At its base, a series of thick, copper-sheathed pipes snaked into the ground, the direct connection to the Metropolitan Line's ventilation system. They moved like shadows, timing their dashes between the guards' slow, mechanical patrols. The heat became oppressive as they neared the foundry's core. The sound of hammers on anvils was deafening, a cacophony of metal on metal that masked the sound of their boots. They reached the service entrance of the cooling tower. The door was a massive slab of cast iron, locked not with a key, but with a complex brass dial, a combination lock. Arthur knelt before the dial. He didn't have the code, but he had something better, the memory of the RT key and the blueprints he had seen in the manager's office. Ramsay's mind was a grid, a series of mathematical certainties. Arthur placed his ear against the metal and began to turn the dial, listening for the subtle click of the internal tumblers. Hurry! Elara urged, glancing back at a guard whose brass-helmeted head was rotating toward their position. The first tumbler fell. The second. On the third turn, the heavy door groaned and swung inward. A blast of humid, chemical-scented air hit them. Inside, the tower was a vertical labyrinth of catwalks and spinning turbines. In the center of the chamber sat the machine Silas had described. It was a massive, brass-bellied contraption, topped with a glass globe filled with the swirling, toxic purple essence of the widow's sigh. A clockwork timer on the front of the machine was counting down. 10 minutes. Pendergast. A voice echoed from the shadows above. Arthur looked up. Standing on a high catwalk, silhouetted against the roaring furnace light, was Julian Ramsay. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was a man of 60, with a face like a flint stone and eyes that burned with the cold fire of a fanatic. You are just in time. Ramsay shouted over the roar of the turbines. London is about to take its final, peaceful breath. The air inside the cooling tower was a suffocating soup of oil and ozone. High above, Julian Ramsay stood like a conductor before an orchestra of destruction. The massive brass machine, the architect's lung, shuddered with every tick of its clockwork heart. The purple liquid in the glass globe atop the device began to bubble, hissing as it transitioned from a stable fluid into a volatile, pressurized gas. "Look at it," Pendergast. Ramsay's voice carried through the roar of the turbines, amplified by the tower's hollow acoustics. "The city is a diseased organism. It is overcrowded, filthy, and loud. I am merely providing a quietus. By tomorrow morning, London will be a silent monument to order." Arthur didn't answer. He was scanning the base of the machine. He saw the thick copper pipes that led into the floor. If that gas was released, it would flood the Metropolitan line, using the city's own lungs to distribute the poison to every station from Paddington to Farringdon. "The timer, Arthur," Elara whispered, pointing to the brass dial. 7 minutes. Arthur stepped toward the machine, his pry bar held ready. Suddenly, the floor plates groaned. From behind the central turbine, 2 iron guards emerged. Their brass visors hissed as steam vented from their neck joints. They moved faster than the ones outside. These were the sentry models, built for speed and close-quarters combat. "Don't touch the controls," Ramsay warned from the catwalk. "The glass is pressurized. One strike, and you'll be the first to taste the widow's sigh." Arthur dodged a heavy, mechanical swing from the first guard. The metal arm smashed into a brick pillar, showering him with dust and mortar. These things weren't just strong. They were relentless. He realized he couldn't beat them with force. He had to use the environment. "Elara." The pressure valves on the side of the turbine. Arthur shouted, ducking under a second blow that whistled over his head. Elara saw what he meant. A series of red-handled valves controlled the steam flow to the hydraulic guards. She scrambled over a pile of coal and grabbed the nearest handle. It was hot, searing her palms, but she gritted her teeth and turned it with all her strength. A jet of scalding white steam erupted from a burst pipe, hitting the first iron guard directly in its midsection. The machine's gears seized as the moisture fouled its internal combustion. It let out a long, metallic shriek and collapsed, its limbs twitching in a spray of oil. 5 minutes. Arthur used the distraction to lunge at the second guard. He didn't hit the torso. He jammed his iron pry bar into the rotating knee joint. There was a sound of crunching brass, and the guard toppled forward. Before it could recover, Arthur used the bar as a lever to pin its arm against the machine's cooling fins. "A valiant effort, detective," Ramsay sneered. He pulled a lever on the catwalk railing. "But the timer is mechanical. It cannot be stopped from the floor." The floor beneath Arthur and Elara began to vibrate violently. A secondary set of pumps engaged, and the purple gas began to move into the primary distribution pipes. "I don't need to stop the timer, Ramsay," Arthur yelled back, his eyes fixed on the glass globe. "I just need to change the destination." He looked at the junction box where the copper pipes met. If he couldn't stop the gas, he had to vent it, not into the tunnels, but back up the cooling tower and into the sky, where the wind would disperse it safely over the river. The vibration in the floor was now a bone-shaking roar. The architect's lung was no longer just ticking. It was breathing, a rhythmic, wheezing sound of high-pressure pumps forcing the widow's sigh toward the veins of London. The purple liquid in the glass globe was swirling into a violent vortex, turning into a thick, shimmering mist that pressed against its transparent cage. 3 minutes. "You can't vent it, Pendergast," Ramsay shouted from his high perch, his face illuminated by the eerie violet glow of the poison. "The seals are made of reinforced lead. The only way to redirect the flow is through the master manifold, and that is up here with me." Arthur looked up at the maze of catwalks and ladders. Ramsay was right. The primary valves were 10 feet above their heads, reachable only by a narrow iron ladder that was currently being guarded by the dying, twitching limbs of the fallen iron guard. "Elara," I need you to climb the secondary turbine housing," Arthur commanded, his voice barely audible over the mechanical thunder. "If you can reach the emergency release for the cooling water, it will drop the temperature in the manifold. It won't stop the gas, but it will slow the pressure enough for me to force the lever." Elara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a handful of greasy cables and hauled herself upward. Her silk dress was a rag now, her hands black with soot, but the fire in her eyes was brighter than the furnace. She scrambled over the vibrating metal casing of the turbine, her fingers searching for the heavy red wheel of the coolant release. Arthur, meanwhile, lunged for the ladder. The second iron guard, pinned but not defeated, lashed out with its free leg. The heavy brass boot caught Arthur in the ribs, sending him sprawling across the slick stone floor. He gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a painful rush. For a moment, the world turned grey. "Arthur!" Elara screamed. She had reached the wheel. She threw her entire weight against it. The wheel groaned, a pipe overhead burst, showering the entire room in a freezing spray of river water. The steam in the tower condensed instantly, creating a thick, blinding fog. The sudden temperature drop had the intended effect. The purple mist in the globe slowed its frantic swirling. The pressure gauge needle, which had been buried in the red zone, flickered and dropped a fraction. 2 minutes. Arthur rolled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. He grabbed the pry bar and used it to vault over the twitching arm of the pinned guard. He scrambled up the ladder, the freezing water drenching him. He reached the catwalk just as Ramsey was reaching for a secondary override, a lever that would bypass the cooling system and force the gas out immediately. "Enough, Ramsey!" Arthur roared, swinging the pry bar. The metal bar struck the catwalk railing with a shower of sparks, narrowly missing Ramsey's hand. The two men stood face to face on the narrow, vibrating bridge. Ramsey looked less like a gentleman now and more like a cornered animal, his fine hair plastered to his forehead. "You don't understand," Ramsey hissed, his hand hovering over the override. "Progress requires sacrifice. The silence I offer is a gift. London doesn't want your gift," Arthur retorted. "It wants to breathe." Arthur lunged forward, not for Ramsey, but for the master manifold lever behind him. Ramsey threw a frantic punch, but Arthur caught the man's arm, using his momentum to swing around and grab the cold iron handle of the manifold. 1 minute. Arthur heaved. The lever didn't move. It was locked by a secondary clockwork pin, a final safety measure designed by the architect. "It won't turn," Pendergast. Ramsey laughed, a high, frantic sound. "The sequence is locked. In 60 seconds, the lungs of the city belong to me." The clockwork pin was a tiny, stubborn tooth of brass, holding the master manifold lever in place. Arthur could see it twitching with every second that passed on the machine's primary dial. Below, the purple mist began to hiss into the intake valves. The sound was like 1,000 serpents waking at once. 50 seconds. "The sequence is absolute," Ramsey screamed, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He threw himself at Arthur, his fingers clawing for the detective's throat. "You cannot break the geometry of my design." Arthur grappled with the older man on the narrow catwalk. The iron floor beneath them groaned under the weight. Ramsey was surprisingly strong, fueled by the manic energy of a man watching his life's work reach its crescendo. They rolled across the grating, the freezing river water from the burst pipe slicking the metal. "The geometry is flawed, Ramsey," Arthur grunted, pinning the engineer's arm against the railing. "Because you forgot about friction." 30 seconds. Arthur reached into his waistcoat pocket. He didn't pull out a tool or a weapon. He pulled out the silver pin he had taken from the warehouse, the symbol of the silver circle. It was small, polished, and made of high-quality silver. He jammed the edge of the pin into the narrow gap where the clockwork locking pin met the manifold housing. "No!" Ramsey shrieked, realizing Arthur's intent. Arthur used his heavy cane to strike the back of the silver pin like a hammer. The soft silver deformed, wedging itself into the delicate gears of the locking mechanism. There was a sound of snapping brass, the sound of the architect's perfect sequence breaking. 15 seconds. The manifold lever shuddered. Arthur threw his entire weight against it. With a bone-deep groan of metal, the lever moved. Instead of opening the pipes leading down to the Metropolitan line, the manifold shifted the flow to the massive exhaust flues of the cooling tower. The internal pressure of the machine found its new exit. 5, 4, 3. A deafening sound echoed through the tower. A massive plume of purple gas erupted from the machine, but it didn't go down into the darkness of the tunnels. It surged upward, propelled by the tower's natural draft, shooting into the sky like a volcanic eruption. High above the foundry, the cold London winds caught the toxic mist, tearing it apart and scattering it harmlessly into the clouds over the Thames. "My machine," Ramsay whispered, his hands falling limp. "My silence." The back pressure from the sudden redirection was too much for the old seals. The glass globe atop the architect's lung shattered. A small cloud of the widow's sigh billowed out onto the catwalk. Arthur scrambled back, pulling his coat over his mouth and nose. "Ramsay, move." But Julian Ramsay didn't move. He stood in the center of the purple haze, his arms outstretched, watching his masterpiece crumble. He took a deep, final breath of his own creation. His eyes glazed over instantly, and he slumped against the railing. With a final, weary sigh, the architect tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the roaring furnace light below. Arthur collapsed on the catwalk, gasping for clean air as the last of the gas cleared. Below, Elara stood by the cooling wheel, her face wet with tears and river water. The tower was finally silent. The silence that followed the architect's fall was not the peaceful quiet Julian Ramsay had envisioned. It was a heavy, industrial silence, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the distant, rhythmic clanging of the foundry's automated hammers. Arthur Pendergast remained on the catwalk, his lungs burning. He watched the last of the purple mist dissipate into the rafters. The architect's lung was now a hollow corpse of brass and iron. "Arthur!" Elara's voice rose from the floor of the tower. She had climbed down from the turbine housing and was standing near the base of the machine. "Is it over? Is he? He's gone, Elara." Arthur called back, his voice hoarse. He slowly stood up, his body aching from the struggle on the catwalk. He fell into his own fire. He descended the ladder carefully, his boots clanking on the metal rungs. When he reached the floor, he found Elara staring at the shattered remains of the glass globe. Despite the grime and the terror, she looked like a woman who had found her own strength. She wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a witness to the saving of a city. "We need to leave," Arthur said, taking her arm. "The pressure in the boilers is still unstable. This whole place could go at any moment." But as they turned to leave, a strange sound echoed through the tower. It wasn't the sound of a machine or a man. It was a voice, a recording. Arthur stopped and looked back at the base of the machine. A small, brass phonograph cylinder was spinning in a hidden compartment near the manifold. "To whoever finds the ruins of my design." The silver circle was the blood, and the iron weaver was the bone. But the mind is far more resilient. My death is merely a gear turning in a much larger clock. Look to the east, detective. Look to the Whitechapel. The cylinder reached the end of its groove and snapped. The voice, Ramsay's voice, recorded before the final confrontation, went silent. He knew. Elara whispered, her face pale. He knew he might fail. He wasn't the master. Arthur realized, his eyes narrowing. He was the architect, yes. He built the structure. But a building needs a tenant. He was working for someone else. They hurried out of the cooling tower, passing the inert, steaming bodies of the iron guards. The foundry was starting to wake up. The night shift of human workers, unaware of the drama in the central tower, were beginning their rounds. Arthur and Elara slipped through a side gate, disappearing into the grey, soot-choked streets of Blackfriars just as the first police whistles began to blow. They reached the Thames embankment as the sun finally cleared the horizon. The river was a muddy ribbon of gold. People were beginning to emerge from their homes, heading to work, opening shops, and boarding the very trains that would have been their tombs. London was breathing, loud and chaotic as ever. What did he mean, Arthur? Elara asked, looking toward the sprawling, crowded districts of the East End. The Whitechapel. It means the game hasn't ended, Arthur said, reaching into his pocket and finding the silver pin, now twisted and broken. It has only moved to a darker stage. The architect is dead, but the ghost is still in the machine. The transition from the industrial roar of Blackfriars to the stifling, labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel felt like descending into a fever dream. If Highgate was the city's polished face and the Dials its desperate gut, Whitechapel was its raw, bleeding heart. Here, the fog didn't just hang in the air. It clung to the brickwork like a shroud, carrying the scent of salt, raw gin, and the metallic tang of the nearby slaughterhouses. Arthur and Elara sought refuge in a two-penny hangover, a dilapidated lodging house where the desperate paid 2 pence to sleep sitting up, slumped over a long rope stretched across the room. It was a miserable place, but in its anonymity, they were safe. No one looked twice at a disheveled man and a woman in rags. Here, misery was the common uniform. The Whitechapel. Arthur murmured, leaning against a damp wall as Elara rested her head on her knees. He was studying a tattered map of the East End. Ramsay was an engineer of systems, but Whitechapel is a place of chaos. It defies geometry. Why lead us here? Perhaps because you can't build a machine in a place like this, Elara suggested, her voice thin with exhaustion. You can only hide one. Arthur nodded. The architect mentioned the mind. Harrington was the money. Ramsay was the builder. But who provides the motive? Who benefits from a silent London? He left Elara under the watchful, if indifferent, eye of the lodging housekeeper and stepped out into the night. He needed information, and there was only one man in the East End who knew the pulse of the gutter. Blind Amos. Amos wasn't actually blind, but he wore heavy dark spectacles and sat on a crate near the 10 Bells Tavern, listening to the secrets that fell from the lips of drunkards and sailors. Arthur dropped a shilling into Amos's tin cup. The sound was distinctive, and the old man's head cocked to the side. That's the ring of a man who's been spending time with silver. Amos rasped. But you smell of sulphur and river mud. Pendergast. You've been to the foundry. Ramsay is dead, Amos, Arthur said, crouching low so their conversation stayed beneath the din of the street. But he left a message. He pointed to the east. Who is moving into the void he left behind? Amos leaned in, his breath smelling of onions and stale ale. The void isn't empty, detective. It never was. Ramsay and Harrington were just the storefront. The man in the back room. They call him the Sovereign. He doesn't care for masks or iron guards. He deals in information. He's been buying up the telegraph lines, the printing presses, and the post offices. A monopoly on truth. Arthur whispered. Exactly. Why kill a city with gas when you can kill it with lies? If you want to find the Sovereign, look for the Silent Press. It's a printing house near the marshes. They say the ink there never dries, because the news they print changes every hour to suit the man who pays. As Arthur turned to leave, Amos grabbed his sleeve. Wait. There's a rumor. A new play is being advertised at the Pavilion. Not a comedy, not a drama. They call it The Fall of London. It opens tomorrow. And they say the lead actress looks exactly like the lady you're traveling with. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. The sovereign wasn't just hiding. He was mocking them. He was turning their escape into a script. The silent press sat on the ragged edge of the Isle of Dogs, where the Thames curved like a sickle and the marshes breathed a thick, malodorous mist. It was a low, sprawling building of soot-stained brick, isolated from the crowded tenements of Whitechapel. Unlike the foundry, there were no roaring furnaces here, only the rhythmic, ghostly description of steam-powered printing presses and the smell of fresh ink, which hung in the damp air like the scent of wet charcoal. Arthur approached the perimeter with the caution of a man walking through a minefield. He had left Elara at the lodging house with a strict warning. If he didn't return by midnight, she was to find Inspector Reed and tell him the name the Sovereign. He found a side window with a cracked pane and peered inside. The interior was a cavern of paper. Reams of newsprint were stacked 10 feet high, creating a white labyrinth. In the center of the room, 6 massive presses were in motion, their iron arms moving with a terrifying, mindless grace. But there were no workers. The machines were automated, fed by long belts of paper that seemed to move of their own accord. Arthur slid through the window, landing silently on a pile of discarded drafts. He picked up a sheet. The headline was dated for tomorrow morning. "The Great Sleep. London mourns as thousands fail to wake." The blood in Arthur's veins turned to ice. Ramsay had failed to release the gas, but the Sovereign had already printed the obituary of the city. The news is only a lie if the event doesn't happen. "Mr. Pendergast." A voice boomed from the rafters. Arthur spun around, his hand flying to the empty holster at his hip. Standing on a wooden gantry above the presses was a man who looked like the very definition of Victorian prosperity. He wore a charcoal grey frock coat, a silk cravat, and a top hat polished to a mirror shine. His face was unremarkable, the kind of face you would see on 1,000 bank clerks, but his eyes were as cold and calculating as a ledger. "The Sovereign, I presume," Arthur said, stepping into the light of a gas lamp. "I prefer the editor," the man replied, descending the stairs with measured steps. Julian Ramsay was a romantic. He thought he could solve the city's problems with chemistry. He wanted a silent London. I, however, want a compliant London. A city that believes what I tell it to believe. You were going to let him kill thousands just to sell a headline. Not just to sell a headline, Arthur. To create a vacuum. When the city woke in terror, those who survived, they would look for a savior. And here, in these pages, I have already written the name of the man who discovered the cure. Me. The editor gestured to the presses. The Silver Circle funded the infrastructure. The architect built the delivery system. I simply provide the narrative. And since you've destroyed the delivery system, I've had to edit the script. He snapped his fingers. From behind the stacks of paper, 4 men emerged. They weren't clockwork guards, they were paper boys, thugs dressed in the leather aprons of printers, their hands stained black with ink. Each carried a heavy lead pipe used for setting large type headers. "You're a dead story, Pendergast." The editor sneered. "And dead stories don't make the morning edition." The printing house felt like the belly of a great leviathan, the mechanical description of the presses acting as its heartbeat. The 4 paperboys closed in, their leather aprons stained with the black blood of the industry. Arthur stood his ground in the center of the paper labyrinth, his only weapon the heavy iron pry bar he'd tucked into his belt back at the foundry. The first thug lunged, swinging a heavy lead pipe. Arthur parried the blow, the vibration humming through his arm. He didn't wait for a second strike. He used the momentum to drive his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him reeling into a stack of tomorrow's news. A cascade of the Great Sleep headlines buried the attacker in a white shroud. "You're fighting the inevitable, Pendergast," the editor shouted from the safety of the gantry. "Information is the new currency. You can't stop the flow." "I can certainly clog the drain," Arthur shouted back. The remaining 3 men attacked simultaneously. Arthur ducked a swing that whistled over his head, the lead pipe shattering a nearby gas lamp. Flames sputtered from the broken fixture, licking at the edges of the dry newsprint. In the flickering light, Arthur saw his opportunity. He scrambled toward the nearest press, the Goliath 4, which was churning out thousands of pages a minute. The paper boys pursued him, their boots hitting the ink-slicked floor. Arthur grabbed a heavy roll of unprinted paper and heaved it into the path of the lead thug. The man tripped, and Arthur delivered a sharp blow with the pry bar to the man's wrist, disarming him. The fire from the broken lamp began to spread, the dry paper acting like tinder. Smoke, thick and black, started to fill the rafters. The building. One of the thugs cried out, his bravado vanishing as a wall of fire rose between them and the exit. The ink is oil-based. It'll blow. Stay and finish him. The editor roared, his face contorting with rage. The archives must be protected. But the thugs had no loyalty to a man who would let them burn. They turned and fled toward the loading docks, leaving Arthur alone with the Sovereign. Arthur looked up. The editor was frantically trying to gather a set of leather-bound ledgers from a safe on the gantry. These were the true records of the Sovereign's empire, the names of the corrupt officials, the bribed police, and the secret investors of the Silver Circle. The story is changing, editor, Arthur yelled, starting up the iron stairs as the heat below became intense. It's no longer the Great Sleep. It's the Great Fire. Oh, never. The editor screamed. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his waistcoat. As Arthur reached the top of the stairs, the Sovereign fired. The bullet grazed Arthur's cheek, drawing a thin line of fire, but the detective didn't flinch. He swung the pry bar, catching the man's wrist. The derringer hit the floor, disappearing into the rising flames below. The Sovereign backed away, clutching his ledgers to his chest. Behind him, the window looked out over the black, oily waters of the Thames marshes. You can't prove anything without these. The editor hissed, his voice trembling. I am the voice of London. Then it's time for a moment of silence. Arthur said. He lunged. The two men grappled at the edge of the gantry as the floor beneath them began to warp from the heat. The heat from the burning newsprint rose in a blistering wave, the oil-based ink fueling a fire that roared like a living beast. The Sovereign, the man who would be the editor of London's destiny, clung to his leather-bound ledgers with the white-knuckled grip of a drowning man. His face, once the picture of cool, bureaucratic indifference, was now a mask of frantic desperation. You don't understand the power of the record. The editor shrieked over the roar of the flames. If these burn, the history of the last decade is rewritten. The men I own will become saints. The truth dies with this paper. Then let it die. Arthur growled, his hand locked onto the editor's lapel. A truth built on lies isn't worth the ink it's printed with. The iron gantry groaned as the support beams below began to buckle. With a sickening lurch, the walkway tilted toward the window. The Sovereign lost his footing, his expensive boots sliding on the soot-covered metal. He tumbled backward, crashing through the glass of the large industrial window. For a heartbeat, Arthur held onto the man's sleeve. They dangled over the black, sucking more of the Isle of Dogs marshes. Below, the tide was out, leaving a treacherous expanse of waist-deep silt and rotting shipyard debris. Drop the ledgers, and I can pull you up. Arthur shouted, his muscles screaming under the strain. The editor looked at the fire behind Arthur, then down at the cold, dark mud. He looked at the ledgers, his life's work, his insurance, his throne. A flicker of madness danced in his eyes. He didn't drop the books. Instead, he used his free hand to shove Arthur's arm away. I am the story. He cried. He fell. There was no splash, only a heavy, wet impact as the Sovereign hit the marsh. The silt swallowed him almost instantly, the heavy ledgers acting like an anchor, pulling him deeper into the lightless muck. He didn't scream. He simply vanished into the blackness of the Thames secrets. Arthur scrambled back onto the tilting gantry just as the Goliath press exploded behind him, sending a shower of molten lead and burning paper into the air. He didn't look back. He leaped from the gantry onto a stack of unburnt paper and rolled toward the loading dock doors. He burst out into the cool night air, gasping as he collapsed onto the wet gravel. Behind him, the silent press was a pillar of orange flame, illuminating the marshes for miles. The obituary of London was burning, and with it, the man who had written it. Arthur! He looked up to see a dark shape approaching through the mist. It was a police hansom, and jumping from the step was Inspector Reed, followed by a frantic Elara. The building, the fire. Elara gasped, throwing her arms around him. We saw the glow from Whitechapel. The Sovereign is in the marsh, Reed. Arthur said, his voice a ragged whisper. He looked at his blackened hands. The ledgers went with him. The names, the bribes, they're all under 10 feet of silt. Reed looked at the inferno, his face grim. Then the silver circle is truly broken. But without those names, half the villains in this city will walk free tomorrow. Not all of them, Arthur said. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a single, charred page he had snatched during the struggle. It wasn't a list of names. It was a map. Ramsay built the machines. The editor wrote the lies. But this shows where they kept the mind. The map pointed further east, past the docks, to a place where the city ended and the sea began. The Nor. The police launch. The Vigilant, cut through the choppy, slate-grey waters of the Thames estuary. Behind them, the smouldering skyline of London was a distant, soot-stained memory, replaced now by a vast and salt-sprayed horizon where the river finally surrendered its secrets to the North Sea. Inspector Reed stood firmly at the prow, his hand resting on the cold hilt of his service cutlass, while Elara huddled in the small cabin, wrapped tightly in a heavy naval coat. Arthur Pendergast stared intently at the charred map he had salvaged. The destination was a lonely point in the water known as the Nor. As the sun began its low, blood-red descent, a jagged silhouette emerged from the white foam. It was an old sea fort, a squat, octagonal tower of weathered granite and rusted iron built during the long wars with Bonaparte. It sat solitary upon a shifting sandbank, accessible only at the lowest tide. This was the fortress in the foam. The place where the Sovereign had established his final, most secret redoubt. There are no lights showing. Reed whispered as the launch pulled alongside the barnacle-crusted iron stilts. The whole place looks completely abandoned. A spider does not light its web to catch a fly, Inspector. Arthur replied, his voice grim. They climbed the slick, rusted iron rungs, the freezing spray of the sea drenching their clothes. When they reached the upper gallery, the silence was absolute, broken only by the wind. Arthur pushed open a heavy copper door. Inside, the air was unnaturally warm and hummed with a familiar, low-frequency vibration. The room was a cathedral of copper wires. Thousands of telegraph lines, diverted from the massive undersea cables that linked the British Empire to the rest of the world, converged here in a chaotic tangle. In the center sat a mahogany console where a single man sat with his back to them. He was not wearing a mask. He wore only a simple telegraphist's headset and a plain linen shirt. "You are remarkably late, Mr. Pendergast," the man said. His voice was soft, devoid of the editor's arrogance or Ramsay's mechanical mania. "I have already transmitted the final signals to the world." Arthur stepped forward, his iron pry bar raised. "The Sovereign is dead, boy. The press is nothing but ash. There are no more lies left to tell." The man turned his chair. He was young, perhaps no more than 20, with eyes that seemed to see in binary patterns. "The Sovereign was a collector of secrets, but I am the distributor. I have just sent a message to every major capital. It contains the private bank records of the cabinet, the secret treaties of the crown, and the true identities of every single spy in the Silver Circle. You will start a global war." Reed gasped, drawing his pistol. "I have started the truth." The boy replied calmly, "The mind does not seek to rule. It seeks to dissolve. The world you know, detective, is built on a foundation of hidden papers. I have just removed the ink." Suddenly, the fort shuddered. A low, rhythmic description of a massive explosive charge started beneath their feet. The sovereign had a final failsafe. The boy smiled. If the mind is found, it must be erased. Arthur looked at the wires, then at the open door. They had only seconds to survive the impending blast. The vibration increased into a deep, sub-bass groan that rattled Arthur's teeth and made the copper wires hum like a disturbed nest of hornets. The young man at the console remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the mahogany desk as if he were waiting for a concert to begin. He looked almost peaceful, a digital saint in a chapel made of stolen secrets and electricity. "The boat, Reed. Get Elara to the launch." Arthur's voice was a roar, competing with the rising mechanical scream of the fort's self-destruct mechanism. Inspector Reed didn't argue. He knew the sound of a structural failure. He grabbed Elara by the arm, who was staring in paralyzed horror at the boy. "Arthur, come on. There's no time. Go. I'll be right behind you." Arthur shouted, his eyes fixed on the central console. Arthur didn't run for the exit. He lunged toward the boy. "You think you're freeing the world with this? You're just setting it on fire. Chaos isn't truth, it's just a different kind of darkness." The boy looked up, his eyes glassy. "Fire cleans. Detective. The structures must burn before anything real can grow. I am the spark." The first explosion rocked the lower level of the tower, a muffled crump that sent a plume of black smoke and orange fire shooting up through the floorboards. The fort tilted precariously to the left, the granite foundations groaning as the iron stilts began to buckle under the heat. Arthur reached for the master logbook, a thick, metal-clasped volume bolted to the side of the console. If the mind had leaked the Empire's secrets to the world, the only way to prevent a global catastrophe was to know exactly what had been sent and to whom. He jammed his iron pry bar into the chain, his muscles straining against the heat. "Let it go, Pendergast." The boy whispered, the first sign of emotion, a strange, frantic pity, flickering in his voice. With a final, desperate heave, the chain snapped. Arthur tucked the heavy book under his arm just as a second, much larger explosion tore the roof off the octagonal room. The night sky rushed in, cold and violent, filled with the scent of salt and burning chemicals. Arthur didn't look back. He sprinted for the gallery, the floor dissolving behind him into a pit of fire. He reached the jagged edge of the stone balcony and saw the police launch pulling away, struggling against the turbulent wake created by the fort's collapse. "Jump, Arthur!" Elara's scream was nearly lost in the wind. He leaped. The fall felt like an eternity. He hit the freezing water of the Thames estuary like it was solid concrete. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and the weight of the logbook threatened to pull him down into the lightless depths. He kicked frantically, his heavy boots dragging at him, until his head finally broke the surface. He surfaced just as the main magazine of the fort detonated. A pillar of white fire surged into the sky, illuminating the North Sea for miles. The North Fort, the Copper Cathedral, and the boy were gone in a heartbeat. Reed's launch swung around, and several pairs of hands hauled a gasping, shivering Arthur over the gunwale. He collapsed on the deck, coughing up seawater, but his hand never let go of the logbook. As the launch sped back toward the flickering lights of the coast, Arthur wiped the brine from his eyes and opened the metal cover. The first page was not a list of codes. It was a single sentence written in a familiar, elegant hand. "The curtain rises in London. but the stage is in Highgate." Arthur looked at the burning horizon. The mind was a distraction. The architect and the sovereign were the prologue. The real mastermind was still in the city, and they were heading back to where it all began. The journey back to London felt like a slow crawl through a waking nightmare. As the vigilance surged against the incoming tide, the orange glow of the distant fire at the north faded into a smear of ash against the dawn. Arthur Pendergast sat in the cramped cabin, the logbook open on his lap. He didn't look at the lists of names or the encrypted cables anymore. His eyes were fixed on that final, cryptic sentence. "The curtain rises in London, but the stage is in Highgate." It was a diversion, Arthur said, his voice a low rasp. He looked at Elara, who was shivering despite the heavy naval coat. The silver circle, the architect, even the sovereign. They were the mechanisms of a grand production. They were the stagehands. But we haven't seen the director yet. Who could be higher than the men who built and funded the empire? Reed asked, his hand tight on the wheel. Someone who doesn't care about money or power in the way they did. Arthur replied, someone who cares about the performance. Harrington's estate wasn't just a warehouse, it was a theatre. We need to go back to the source. By the time they reached Highgate, the sun was a cold, pale disk hanging over the cemetery. The village was silent, the residents unaware that their prestigious neighbor had been the heart of a criminal hydra. They approached the silver gate. It stood ajar, the beautiful silver leaf now peeling and tarnished by the humidity of the previous night's chaos. They didn't go to the front door this time. Arthur led them through the botanical gardens, past the shattered ruins of the cooling tower and the chemical workshop he had escaped from only days ago. The air still held the faint, sweet scent of the widow's sigh, a ghost of the poison that had nearly claimed the city. There! Arthur pointed to a small, unassuming stone outbuilding near the edge of the woods. It was an old conservatory, its glass panes clouded with moss and grime. According to the logs, the master circuit doesn't lead to the house. It leads here. He kicked the door open. Inside, it wasn't a greenhouse. It was a perfectly preserved miniature of the Royal Theatre's stage. The final scene. In the center of the room, a single chair faced the miniature stage. Sitting in that chair, perfectly poised with a silver-topped cane resting against his knee, was a man who looked remarkably like Arthur himself, if Arthur were 20 years older and stripped of all empathy. "Welcome home, Arthur," the man said. His voice was like velvet over gravel. "I must say, your performance in the third act was truly inspired. The escape from the marsh was particularly moving." Arthur felt the world tilt. The man was Julian Pendergast, Arthur's own uncle, the man who had supposedly died in a shipwreck 15 years ago. Uncle Julian. Arthur whispered, his grip tightening on his pry bar. "The director, if you please." Julian smiled, standing up. "I created the Silver Circle as a study in human behavior. I wanted to see how much of a city could be controlled by a single script. Harrington was my lead, Ramsay my engineer, and the editor my critic. But you, Arthur, you were the only one who could truly challenge the narrative." The conservatory was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the master circuit hidden beneath the floorboards. The miniature stage in the center was perfect down to the smallest detail, a haunting mirror of the Royal Theatre where this nightmare had first begun. Julian Pendergast watched his nephew with an expression of paternal pride that made Arthur's stomach churn with revulsion. "You died at sea," Arthur said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I saw the wreckage of the Caledonia on the Irish coast. I spent years mourning the man who taught me how to see the world, how to find the truth in the shadows." "A stagehand's trick, Arthur," Julian replied, smoothing the lapel of his immaculate charcoal coat. "The world believes what it is told, especially when the story is tragic. I needed to vanish so I could watch the play from the gallery. And you, my dear nephew, have been my favorite lead actor. Every case you've solved for the last decade was a scene I wrote to test your limits. The silver circle was simply the grand finale. Elara stepped forward, her face a mask of cold, defiant fury. You used me. You used the entire city. You nearly gassed 1 million people for a performance. For a game of social engineering. Drama requires stakes, Miss Elara. Julian said dismissively. The circle was an exploration of how greed, industry, and information intersect. It was a masterpiece. But every masterpiece needs a climax. The threat to London was the final curtain call, the moment where the hero either rises or falls. Inspector Reed raised his service revolver, his hand shaking with a mix of exhaustion and rage. You're a monster, Pendergast. The older one, anyway. You're under arrest for treason, kidnapping, and mass murder. Put your hands up. Julian laughed softly. It was a sound Arthur remembered from his childhood, warm, yet utterly hollow. Arrest. Inspector, you are still thinking like a character in a penny dreadful. This conservatory is rigged with the last of Ramsay's pressure plate inventions. If my heart stops, or if I press this small silver stud on my cane, the foundations of this estate will collapse. We would all be buried in this stage together. Arthur looked at his uncle, truly seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the mentor he loved. It was a man who had replaced his soul with a script. You think you're the director, Julian. But a play is nothing without the actor's choices. You didn't predict Elara's defiance. You didn't predict the milk wagon. You calculated the math of the city. But you forgot the weight of the human spirit. Spirit is a variable that can be controlled with enough pressure. Julian countered. He stepped toward the model theatre. Now, the final choice. You can take the logbook and walk away. I vanish, and you become the hero who saved London. Or, you try to take me, and we all die in the rubble of my greatest work. What is the ending of your story, Arthur? The tension was a physical weight. Arthur felt the blood of the Pendergasts, his own blood, thumping in his ears. He looked at the logbook, then at the man who had forged him into a weapon of logic. The air in the conservatory was thick with the scent of damp moss and the metallic tang of hidden machinery. Arthur Pendergast looked at his uncle, Julian, the man who had sculpted his mind with the precision of a clockmaker. The choice seemed binary, a cold calculation between survival and justice. But Arthur knew that in any grand production, the most important movements happen in the wings, out of sight of the audience. You've always been fond of the Sophie's Choice scenario, Julian. Arthur said, his voice steadying. He began to pace slowly around the miniature theatre, his eyes scanning the floorboards, the wires, and the silver stud on Julian's cane. You think it proves that even the most moral man can be broken by the math of survival. But you've made a fatal error in your own script. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. And what might that be, my dear boy? You assumed I was still your student. Arthur replied. He stopped pacing and pointed his iron pry bar toward the base of the miniature stage. Those pressure plates you mentioned, they aren't connected to the foundations of the estate. They are connected to the master circuit. And the master circuit doesn't lead to explosives. It leads to the telegraph lines. Inspector Reed tightened his grip on his revolver, his eyes darting between the uncle and the nephew. Elara stood perfectly still, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. You aren't planning to blow us up, Julian. Arthur continued, taking a bold step forward. That would be a messy, unscripted ending. You're planning to send a kill signal to the remaining silver circle cells across the globe. You're planning to erase the witnesses from the inside, ensuring that even if you vanish, the truth remains buried under a mountain of accidental deaths. Julian's thumb twitched over the silver stud. A clever theory. But are you willing to bet 3 lives on the intuition of a detective who lost his own home tonight? I'm not betting on intuition. Arthur said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the broken silver pin. "I'm betting on friction." In a blurred motion, Arthur didn't lunge for Julian. He hurled the twisted silver pin into the gears of the miniature theater's clockwork mechanism. The silver metal, soft and malleable, jammed the rotating cogs that fed the master circuit's power. A shower of sparks erupted from the floorboards. The hum of the machinery rose to a shrill whistle, then died with a pathetic, grinding moan. Julian pressed the stud on his cane repeatedly, but the script had been cut. The connection was dead. "The play is over, Uncle," Arthur said. The director's mask finally cracked. Julian's face contorted into a snarl of pure, aristocratic rage. He lunged at Arthur, swinging his silver-topped cane like a club. Arthur parried with the pry bar, the ring of metal on metal echoing like a gong through the glass house. For a moment, they were two shadows dancing in a ruined garden. Julian was fast, fueled by a decade of hidden preparation, but Arthur was driven by the weight of a city he had saved. With a sharp twist of his wrist, Arthur disarmed his uncle, sending the silver cane clattering into the moss. "Reed, take him," Arthur commanded, as the inspector moved to cuff the mastermind. Julian looked at the ruined miniature stage. "You think you've won, Arthur? You've only destroyed the props. The audience is still out there, waiting for the next act." The Old Bailey had seen many villains, but it had never seen a production like the trial of Julian Pendergast. For 6 weeks, the soot-stained walls of London's Central Criminal Court were the center of the world. The Silver Circle was no longer a whispered myth. It was a sprawling, documented reality laid bare before a jury of 12 stunned Londoners. The newspapers called it the Theatre of Truth, and every morning, thousands gathered outside the gates just to catch a glimpse of the man who had nearly turned the city into a graveyard. Arthur Pendergast sat on the hard wooden bench of the witness stand. The air in the courtroom was stifling, heavy with the scent of old parchment and the sweat of the packed gallery. Across the room, behind the iron spikes of the dock, sat his uncle. Julian looked remarkably composed, his hands folded, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of a critic reviewing a mediocre play. "And you say, Mr. Pendergast," the prosecutor began, his voice echoing in the high rafters, "that your uncle did not seek profit, but rather a demonstration. Money was merely the oil for the machine." Arthur replied, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his exhaustion. Julian Pendergast sought to prove that a metropolis is not a collection of people, but a system of levers. He believed that by pulling the right strings, fear, information, and industry, he could script the history of England. The prosecution entered the salvaged logbook into evidence. Though charred and water-damaged, the mine's records provided enough threads for the police to arrest dozens of high-ranking officials, including 2 members of Parliament and the Chief Commissioner of the River Police. The Silver Circle was being dismantled, link by agonizing link. When it was Elara's turn to testify, the courtroom went deathly silent. She walked to the stand with a grace that silenced even the most cynical journalists. She told the story of the blue roses, the sea star necklace, and the cold, mechanical horror of the Blackfriars foundry. She wasn't just an actress anymore. She was the conscience of London. As she spoke, she looked directly at Julian, who offered her a faint, chilling nod of appreciation for her delivery. The defense was brief. Julian refused to plead insanity. He refused to deny the charges. When he finally rose to speak in his own defense, he didn't address the jury. He addressed Arthur. "You have given them a satisfying ending, Arthur," Julian said, his voice resonant and clear. "You have played the hero, and I have played the villain. The audience will go home tonight feeling safe. But remember, the structures I built are still there. The saws, the telegraphs, the press, they are the bones of this city. I merely showed you how easily they can be broken. If not by me, then by the next man who finds the script." The jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. As the judge donned the black cap to pronounce the sentence of death by hanging, Julian didn't flinch. He simply looked at the clock on the wall, as if timing the final curtain. As Arthur walked out of the Old Bailey into the grey London drizzle, he felt no triumph. The silver circle was broken, and the director was headed for the gallows. But as he looked at the bustling streets, he couldn't help but notice the rhythm of the city. The way the people moved in lines, the way the news travelled, the way the shadows clung to the corners. The trial was over, but the city's story was far from finished. The fog had returned to London, but it was no longer the choking, yellow miasma of the Highgate mist. It was a soft, Atlantic grey that blurred the edges of the gas lamps and muffled the clatter of the hansoms on the cobblestones. 3 months had passed since the trapdoor at Newgate had swung shut, ending the life and the direction of Julian Pendergast. The Silver Circle was a memory, its members scattered to the winds or rotting in the hulks of prison ships. Arthur Pendergast stood on the balcony of his new rooms in Bloomsbury. His old home was still a blackened shell, but he found he preferred the simplicity of this new space. No hidden compartments, no library of inherited secrets, just a desk, a bed, and the steady, honest ticking of a clock that didn't hide a timer. A soft knock at the door signaled a visitor. He didn't reach for a revolver this time. He opened the door to find Elara. She was dressed in deep violet, a color of mourning and royalty, looking more vibrant than he had ever seen her. "The carriage is waiting," she said, her voice bright. The Paris Opera won't wait for a tardy actress, even one with a reputation for surviving detective stories. "You're truly leaving, then?" Arthur asked, offering her a faint, sincere smile. "London is a little too loud for me lately, Arthur. Every time I hear a gear turn or a steam pipe hiss, I look for a man in a brass mask. Paris offers a different kind of drama, one that stays on the stage where it belongs." She stepped into the room and placed a small, velvet-lined box on his desk. Inside lay the sea star necklace. The sapphire had been cleaned of its toxic residue, and the hollow chamber was now filled with a simple, dried white rose. "A gift," she said. "A reminder that some things can be beautiful without being a weapon." The final ledger. After Elara left, Arthur sat at his desk and opened a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't the sovereign's ledger or the architect's blueprints. It was his own. He began to cross out the last of the names associated with the case. Lord Harrington, deceased. Julian Ramsay, the architect, deceased. The editor, the sovereign, missing, presumed dead. Julian Pendergast, the director, executed. He paused at the last entry. The mind. The boy from the sea fort had never been found. The police assumed he had been vaporized in the explosion, but Arthur remembered the way the boy had looked at the copper wires, as if he were part of them. A final envelope had arrived in the Morning Post, bearing no return address and a postmark from Zurich. Inside was a single telegraph strip, the paper perforated with a series of holes that formed a pattern Arthur had seen once before in the fortress in the foam. When translated, the message was simple. "The script has been burned. The stage is empty. Watch the wires." Arthur walked to the window and looked out at the city. The telegraph lines crisscrossed the sky like a spider's web, vibrating silently in the wind. The director was dead, but the world was changing. Information was still flowing, faster and more invisible than ever before. He picked up his silver-topped cane, a new one, simple and solid, and donned his hat. There would always be another shadow, another secret hidden in the hum of the modern world. He turned off the gas lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and stepped out into the London night. The play was over. The work continued.